The summer of 1886 didn't come to Stone Falls. It took the town by force fields, cracked open under a sun that had no mercy left. Cattle ribs showed through hide. The creek south of town had forgotten how to move. In the square, an 8-foot post stood across from the courthouse. A sign hung above it, one word in black paint. Liar. People passed and looked away. They crossed the street. They pulled their children closer and kept walking. She stood tied to the post, chin up, eyes open. The rope had cut her wrists. The sun had baked her dress dark, but she watched them, every face. She did not look down. No one stopped. Hooves sounded on the packed dirt. A single horse from the north road. The rider pulled up at the edge of the square. He saw the post. He saw the woman who refused to break. He stepped down from the saddle. His hand went to the knife at his belt. He began to walk toward her. The summer of 1886 didn't arrive in Stone Falls. It, invaded, came in like something that had been waiting just past the horizon, patient and deliberate, and then one morning it was simply there, sitting on every rooftop, pressing down on every dry field, pulling the water out of the ground like it was owed a debt nobody remembered taking on. The creek south of town had been called Cold Creek for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody called it that anymore. It was just a ditch now. Brown. Still. The kind of still that makes you uncomfortable if you look at it too long, like something that used to move has forgotten how, and is no longer embarrassed about it. The cattle on the north ranches stood in their fields with their ribs beginning to show through their hides. The corn on the east road had gone the color of old paper. Not yellow, old paper. The specific shade of something that was once useful and has been sitting in a drawer too long. 3 farming families had already sold what they could and moved on, quietly, without ceremony. The way people leave a place, when leaving feels like failure, and staying feels like slower failure, and there is no version of the story that ends well, so you just pick the one that ends soonest. This was Stone Falls in the summer of 1886. Hot, dry, indebted, and controlled, with a precision that most people in the territory would not have recognized as control, because it didn't look like control. It looked like the natural order of things. It looked like how a town works when one man happens to hold most of the cards. That man was Judge Aldous Merritt. Merritt had come to Stone Falls 4 years earlier, with 2 things that most people in failing western counties would have given a great deal for: legal training and access to capital. He was 57 years old, medium height, the kind of build that suggests a man was once broader and has since settled into a more economical shape. Gray at the temples, eyes the color of old pewter, not warm, not cold, but with the specific neutrality of metal that reflects whatever light is pointed at it without contributing any of its own. He had arrived in the spring of 1882, when the county was genuinely failing. Farms going under, families leaving. The land records were a mess that had accumulated over a decade of insufficient administration. Nobody quite knew who owed what to whom, and the uncertainty was making everything worse. Merritt had looked at this situation and seen correctly that it was a problem that could be solved with proper legal organization and access to money. He had proposed a system of consolidated mortgages, centralized credit, standardized debt terms. The county had been grateful. This was the part that Merritt himself thought about sometimes. In the close office behind the courthouse, where the good lamps ran on imported oil, and the ledgers were kept behind a locked door. He had been genuinely useful at the beginning. Genuinely. The first year had been almost entirely honest. The first adjustment he made to a ledger, one small number, one fee that hadn't quite been agreed to, but that seemed reasonable given the circumstances, had felt, at the time, like pragmatism. Like the kind of small flexibility that keeps systems running when the alternative is rigidity that helps nobody. He had not known then how easy the second adjustment would be. He had not known how each one after that would require less justification than the one before it. He had not known that there was a particular point and that he would pass through it without recognizing it. After which he was no longer a good man, making occasional compromises, and had become something else entirely. By the summer of 1886, Merritt held the mortgage on 22 of the 31 properties in Stone Falls. He controlled the food credit extended through Solt's General Store. He had written the debt terms for 6 of the 7 farming families on the North Road, and he had been adding small, unexplained fees to the accounts of 9 families for the better part of 2 years. Not large fees, never large enough to be dramatic, just enough. An administrative processing charge here, a drought assessment there, a late payment penalty on a payment that had in fact been made early. Just enough to make the next payment difficult, and the one after that. And then you lost the thing you were trying to protect anyway, just slower. And with more suffering distributed across a longer period of time, so that by the end you weren't even sure where to direct the anger because it had taken so long to arrive. That was the system. It was elegant, the way cruelty is always elegant when it has had time to practice. And it ran itself now with very little maintenance required, because the most important part of the system wasn't in any ledger. The most important part was in the heads of every person in Stone Falls who had something to lose. They made the calculations themselves. Fast, quiet, without anyone telling them to. They looked at what Merritt was holding over their heads, and they looked at what was being asked of them. Just keep walking. Just look away. Just find something else to be interested in on this particular morning. And they chose, every single day, to look away. That was the system, and it required almost no maintenance at all. Preston Merritt was 29 years old, and had worked in his uncle's office as a clerk for 3 years. This gave him access to land deed records, mortgage documents, the official stamp the judge used to authenticate paperwork, and a thorough understanding of how the system worked. Which pieces to move, when to move them, and how to make the movement look like ordinary administrative process. Preston was the kind of good-looking who comes from never having been told no by anyone with actual authority. Light brown hair, wide shoulders, a silver watch chain that caught available light, with the cheerful dedication of something that had been specifically designed to be noticed. He was not as intelligent as he believed himself to be. This was, ultimately, the weak point in the entire system. Though neither Merritt nor Preston would have recognized it as such on a Tuesday morning in July 1886, while the town was just beginning its business day, and the temperatures was already climbing toward 100 degrees, and the shame post stood at the center of the square, 8 feet tall. That post, sunk deep into the packed earth, directly across from the courthouse steps, where Judge Merritt could see it. From his office window, if he cared to look. He had looked once, when they first tied her there. Then he had gone back to his desk. The sign above her head was painted in black. Large letters. No hesitation in the brushwork, Liar. Merritt had painted it himself, the night before, in the office. His handwriting on the wood, his brush, his decision about the letter size. Big enough to read from the road. He had wanted people to see it before the heat got bad enough to drive them indoors. He had timed it correctly. It was 8:30 in the morning, and the main street of Stone Falls was doing its business, and every single person who walked past the post found something else to look at. Her name. The name her mother had given her in the Apache tongue her father had spent years trying to learn and never quite managed, translated to something like soaring hawk, the way a hawk moves against wind. Not fighting it, reading it, using it, in Stone Falls. People called her Sarah. Most people called her nothing at all. She was 25 years old. Dark hair that had been pinned up properly that morning, before the men came to her room at the boarding house, before dawn, before the pins had time to hold against what the day had planned for them. A dress that had been pale yellow once, a long time ago, before 3 hours of July sun had opinions about the color. Her wrists were tied behind the post. The rope was the rough kind, the kind that doesn't negotiate with skin. Her mother had been Apache. Her father had been a Scots-Irish trader who had come through the territory when her mother's band was moving south Trent, and who had stayed because her mother was the most practical person he had ever met, and he understood, within about 3 days of meeting her, that this was the rarest quality in the world. He had died when Sarah was 12. Fever. Fast her mother had lived another 8 years. Long enough to teach Sarah everything she knew about reading a situation, reading it the way a hawk reads Jund. Not with sentiment, with precision. With the understanding that what matters is not what you feel about the air currents, but where they will take you if you use them correctly. Sarah had grown up between two worlds in the way that means you belong fully to neither, which means you learn, out of necessity, not choice, to read both. She had learned to read numbers the way other people learn to read faces. Her father's account books had been her first teachers. Then 3 years as a ledger clerk at a land office in Missouri, where she had been paid less than her male counterparts and given half their authority and twice their work, and where she had spent 3 years learning the difference between a legitimate land transfer and a forged one, down to the specific language patterns that betrayed each. When the Missouri Land Office let her go, her employer explaining that his clients found it unsettling to have a woman managing their financial records, that it undermined confidence in the process. She had gone home that night and sat in her room for a long time and thought, all right, if the process doesn't want me, I will learn the process well enough that someday it will need me, whether it wants to or not. 3 years after that, she had been working as cook because the land office work had dried up, and a woman with accounting skills and no male sponsor had approximately 3 viable options in Kansas in 1883. And then she had been working as a cleaning woman in the offices of Judge Aldous Merritt, because it paid 50 cents more per week than anything else available in Stone Falls. And then, 3 weeks ago, she had been cleaning the judge's private office on a Wednesday morning and had opened the wrong drawer. She did not scream. That was the part that made people uncomfortable, though they would not say so directly. If you ask them later, the ones brave enough to be asked, they would talk about the sign, the heat, the post itself. They would not talk about her face, because her face was the problem. She wasn't performing grief. She wasn't performing anger. She wasn't performing anything. She was watching, chin up, eyes moving from face to face as people passed. Not begging, not accusing, just recording. The way you write something down in a ledger because you need to remember it later. She had made herself a promise, somewhere between the boarding house and the post. In the gray hour before the sun, fully committed to the day, she had made a promise. Short, no particular words to it. More like a decision that settled into her bones and stayed there. She would not give them her face. Whatever Merritt wanted from this, the town, the women, watching from the boardwalk across the street, the men who crossed to the other side early enough to pretend they simply hadn't noticed. They were not going to get that particular thing from her. So she watched instead. She memorized. Gideon Solt, owner of the general store on the east corner, crossed the street before he was anywhere near the post. Early enough to look accidental. She noted the angle of his walk, the way he didn't quite look back, which was different from not looking back. Looking back would have required a decision. Not looking back required nothing except momentum. She filed this. Reverend Harmon walked past on the courthouse side, eyes on the ground, which was, she thought, actually the most honest response she'd seen all morning. At least he knew he was doing something wrong. At least he had the self-heart to be uncomfortable about it. There was something almost decent about the ground looking. It was the body telling the truth when the person had decided not to. The Aldred family passed. Husband, wife, 3 children. The wife took the long way around the block. The husband held the youngest child's hand a little tighter than necessary as they passed. The child, who was perhaps 4 years old and had no understanding of what the post was or who was tied to it, looked at Sarah with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has not yet learned that looking is something to be managed. Sarah looked back at the child. The child waved the husband's hand tight further and they moved on. Nobody stopped. That was the agreement. Nothing signed, nothing spoken, nothing that could be pointed to later and called a decision. That was the particular genius of what Merritt had built over 4 years in Stone Falls. You didn't need to threaten people individually. You didn't need to visit their homes in the night or make explicit demands. You just needed to hold their mortgages, control their credit, write the debt terms for the farming families, and then you waited. Because people with something to lose, with land and children, and a business they'd spent their savings building, those people make calculations. Fast, quiet, without anyone telling them to. They look at what you're holding over their heads and they look at what's being asked of them, and they walk. Every time. Cross him, even slow down your wagon within 20 feet of a woman. He'd called a liar, and the numbers in your ledger would be different by morning. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to and call fraud. Just enough. Just a processing fee here. A drought assessment there. A late payment penalty on a payment you knew you'd made early. Just enough to make the next payment impossible. And then the one after that. And then you'd lose the thing you were trying to protect anyway. Just slower, and with more suffering spread across more time, so that by the end you weren't even sure where to direct the anger. That was the system. Elegant, patient. Old enough now to run itself, Sarah stood at the post and memorized faces and made her calculations. She had $12 in her room at the boarding house, hidden inside the lining of a winter coat she hadn't needed in months. $12 and a set of account ledgers she had been keeping. Her own, separate from the official ones. For the 3 months she had worked in Merritt's offices, she did not know what was going to happen today. She did not know if anyone was going to stop. She did not know how long the sentence would run or what came after it. She knew that she was not guilty of what she had been accused of. She knew that the evidence she had seen in Merritt's desk drawer was real. She knew that the signature on the Henderson deed belonged to a man named Thomas Whit, who had been dead since October of 1883, and whose grave she had helped catalog the previous autumn, eastern section, 3rd row from the fence, stone with a crack down the left side. And she knew, with the specific, precise certainty of someone who has spent years learning how false entries make their unavoidable mistakes, that what she had found was not one forged document, it was the visible corner of a system. She stood at the post and breathed carefully and memorized faces and waited, because that was all she could do right now, and because she had not yet given up on the possibility of one person, just one, deciding to be decent. Preston Merritt appeared at 9 o'clock, which told Sarah he'd had a proper breakfast and taken his time with it. He crossed the street with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and the specific unhurried ease of a man who has never once been required to hurry by anything outside his own preferences. Wide shoulders. Silver watch chain catching the morning light. Pleasant expression arranged on a pleasant face. He stood 10 feet from the post. Looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved and is now simply waiting for to conclude itself on schedule. Morning, he said. Conversational. Like they'd run into each other by chance at the market. Sarah looked at him, just that, no words yet. His smile moved, just slightly. He covered the movement with a sip of coffee, but she had seen it. She was a woman who had spent 3 years in a Missouri land office, reading documents that were designed to obscure what they were actually saying, and she had learned to read the smaller language underneath the larger one, the language of small movements, small adjustments, the tells that happen below the level of deliberate presentation. Preston Merritt was not as comfortable as he was pretending to be. That was useful information. You should have taken the offer, he said. It was fair. It was generous, actually, given what you were claiming. There was no offer, she said. There was no offer. There was money I was told to take and a story I was told to stop telling. Those are different things. You were cleaning offices. I was a ledger clerk in Missouri for 3 years before I ever touched a mop, she said. I know what a legitimate land transfer looks like. I know what a forged one looks like. And I know that the signature on the Henderson deed belongs to a man named Thomas Whitfield who died in the fall of 1883. Preston's jaw tightened, just a fraction. Just enough for her to note it and file it. Thomas Whitfield is a common enough name, he said. Thomas Whitfield of this county, she said. Buried in the Stone Falls Cemetery. Eastern section. 3rd row from the fence. The stone has a crack running down the left side. She paused. I helped organize the cemetery records last October. I know exactly where he is. Which means I know exactly what it means that his signature appears on a document dated February of this year. The pleasant expression held, but the edges of it had gone thin. The way paper goes thin when it has been handled too many times in the same places. Still intact on the surface, but you could see through it if you knew where to look. The town doesn't care what you can read, he said. No, she said, the town cares what your uncle permits them to say out loud. That's a different thing. Preston stepped slightly closer. His voice dropped just slightly. Not dramatically. He was too practiced for drama. Just enough to make it feel like something private being said between two people who understand each other. You're going to stand here, he said, until you reconsider your position. And the longer you wait, the less there is to reconsider toward. That's just the math of it. She turned her face toward the north road, not in defeat, not in avoidance, toward something only she could see from where she was standing. Some fixed point on the horizon, something she was holding on to the way you hold on to a specific thought in a loud room, deliberately, with conscious effort, because if you let go of it, the noise takes over. She had nothing left to say to Preston Merritt. He was not the architect of this. He was the instrument, useful, compliant, not particularly complicated. She understood this the way she understood a forged signature. Not with anger, just with the clarity of recognition. The real problem was behind the courthouse window. And she was not going to spend what energy she had left on the instrument when she needed to be thinking about the architect. Preston stood at the post for a while longer, waiting for a response that wasn't coming. This bothered him more than he would have admitted. He was accustomed to compliance through threat. It was, in many ways, the only language he had learned to speak fluently. The language of consequences, stated or implied, delivered with the pleasant surface that made them seem almost reasonable. The woman at the post was not responding to this language. She was not begging, she was not angry. She was not performing distress or negotiating or looking for an exit. She was simply standing there looking at the north road as though he had already left, and she was waiting for something more interesting to arrive. Preston finished his coffee, looked at her for another moment, then turned and walked back across the street, his watch chain catching the sun, his expression still pleasant, his hands not quite steady around the empty tin cup. He did not notice this last detail, but Sarah, who had turned her eyes back from the north road at precisely the moment he started walking away, did. She filed it. The morning continued. The heat increased. By 10 o'clock, the packed earth of the main street was radiating warmth upward in visible waves. By 10:30, most of Stone Falls had retreated into whatever shade was available. Storefronts, covered boardwalks, the slightly cooler interior of the Mercantile, where Salt kept a fan going behind the counter. The women on the boardwalk across the street had thinned to 2, then 1, then none. The men on the courthouse steps had been replaced by a smaller group, and then by Sheriff Devlin Oaks alone, who stood with one hand on his belt, and looked at the post and then at the road, and then at the post again, with the expression of a man who is engaged in a sustained internal argument with himself and is not entirely sure which side is winning. Oaks was 43 years old. He had come to Stone Falls before Merritt had, before the system existed, as a deputy, and had been elected sheriff on his own merits in 1880. He had been a good sheriff once, careful, fair. The kind of man who understood that the law is not the same thing as what's legal, and tried to honor the distinction. He had known, somewhere in the spring of 1883, that things were beginning to go wrong. He had told himself it was complicated, that merit was doing more good than harm overall, that the county needed the stability, that one man's ability to see the whole picture was worth a certain amount of flexibility in how the details were managed. He had told himself this story many times since then. It was wearing thin. Sarah could see this from 20 feet away. She added it to what she was assembling, not with hope. Hope was too soft a tool for this kind of work. With the precise, unsentimental attention of someone doing inventory. What do we have? What do we need? What is the distance between those two things? And then the sound of a horse on the main street. Coming from the north. Colt Deering had not planned to be in Stone Falls that Tuesday. He had a fence line on the south pasture that had been needing attention for 2 weeks. 2 calves that required checking. A water trough on the east side of Ironback Creek that had developed a leak in the pipe fitting that he hadn't located yet. Roughly 9 hours of work standing between him and a meal, and none of it was going to wait politely while he took a social ride into town. But he'd run out of the wound salve he used on wire cuts. Can't manage livestock injuries without it. He'd learned this the hard way, twice. So here he was, 40 years old. 6 feet of weather-worn cowboy on a gray horse called Button, because his wife, Clara, had named that horse. And Clara had a sense of humor that had not consulted him about it, and he had never changed the name after she died, because changing it felt like one change too many in a period that had already required more than his share. Clara had been gone 2 years, February 1884. Came fast, 3 days from the first symptom to the end, and left nothing behind except a cold house and a silence that had settled into the walls of Ironback Creek Ranch like smoke, like something that owned the place now and was simply waiting for Colt to figure out what to do with himself in the meantime. He had not figured it out yet. He functioned. The ranch ran. The cattle were fed and the fences were mostly repaired and the accounts were kept current. But there is a difference between functioning and living. And Colt had known this difference for 2 years and had not found his way across it. He came to Stone Falls only when the ranch absolutely required it. Salt, wire, medication for the animals. He bought what he needed, said as few words as the transaction permitted, and rode back north before the afternoon heat made the return trip miserable. That was the plan. He turned Button onto the main street at 9:30 and saw the post. He saw the sign first, Lyar black paint, large letters, legible from the road. Then he registered the woman tied to it. He pulled Button to a stop. Not a dramatic stop. Not the kind where the horse rears in the dust, settles in a particular way. Just stopped, because his hands made the adjustment before his brain had finished processing the instruction. She was slight, small in the frame, the way some people are small without being diminished by it, as though their size is a choice rather than a limitation. Dark hair half escaped from its pins. A pale yellow dress the sun had been working on for hours, her wrists behind the post, her chin up, and her eyes fixed on the man standing in front of her with an expression that Colt could only describe, even later when he was alone in the ranch house, trying to put words to what he'd seen, as controlled fury, the way a fire stays inside its ring, not because it wants to. Because it has no other choice at this particular moment, and it knows it, and it is choosing to use the constraint rather than be destroyed by it. The man in front of her was Preston Merritt. Colt knew Preston Merritt. He'd had 2 conversations with the man over mortgage matters in the past year. Both of them had left a feeling on his hands afterward. The specific feeling of having touched something that looked clean and wasn't, and of not being able to quite locate the contamination, even though you were certain it was there. He looked at The courthouse steps. Devlin Oaks stood with a small cluster of men watching. Oaks caught Colt's eye and immediately looked at the ground. Colt looked back at the woman at the post. She still hadn't looked at him. She was holding on to whatever she was holding on to. That fixed point past Preston, that private anchor. With the focused determination of someone who has decided exactly what they will, and will not spend their attention on, and is not going to be moved from that decision. He sat on Button for a long moment, the honest truth, the truth he would not fully admit to himself until much later, in the dark of the ranch house. In the room that still smelled faintly of Cedar and Clara's absence, was that he hesitated. He felt the weight of what Merritt held over Ironback Creek settle across his shoulders like a yoke. 14 months of mortgage payments remaining. The land Clara had loved the way some people love breathing. Not poetically, not with speeches about sunsets, but with the practical, animal certainty of a person who knows that without this specific thing, there is simply no remaining. Merritt could call that note in 48 hours. Colt knew this. He knew it the way he knew the fence lines and the water table and the direction of the winter wind. Not from thinking about it. From living with it, he looked at the woman again. And then, before he'd fully decided anything, something else arrived, uninvited, the way it always arrived, usually at night when he was tired enough that the defenses ran slow. A name, Reuben Taft 1881. 5 years ago, but closer than that, in the way that certain things stay close regardless of calendar distance. A man Colt had never met before the case. Accused of stealing horses from a ranch outside of Dodge City. Black man, 32 years old. A family in Wichita, wife, 3 children. He'd been sending money to every month for 6 years without missing one. Colt had been a federal investigator then, 3 years into the work, good at it. He'd had a reputation for being careful and thorough, and for finding the things that weren't immediately visible. He'd found them in the Taft case, too. A witness account that didn't match the timeline by 40 minutes, a brand inconsistency that suggested the horses had been moved before Reuben Taft was anywhere near the property. A financial record that pointed toward the ranch foreman as the actual thief. A man who had a gambling debt, an access that Taft didn't have, and a motive that Taft had never possessed. Colt had brought this to his supervisor. His supervisor had looked at the evidence for a long time. And then he'd said, quietly, in the tone of a man, explaining something to someone who needed to understand how the world actually worked rather than how it was supposed to work, that the county prosecutor had already made commitments, that the case had already been built in a particular direction, that introducing contradictory evidence at this stage would complicate things for people above both of them, and that Colt's career prospects would benefit significantly from understanding that complication as something to avoid rather than something to navigate toward. Colt had gone home that night, sat in his kitchen for 3 hours, made himself the worst bargain a man can make with himself. He told himself it wasn't his decision anymore, that he'd done his part by finding the evidence, that the system would correct itself eventually, that someone else would find the same things eventually. Reuben Taft was convicted, sentenced to 4 years. He died in the prison in Lansing, Kansas, in March of 1882, pneumonia. The winter had been particularly bad that year. His wife learned about it from a letter the prison sent to the last address on file, which was the boarding house where Taft had been living before his arrest, and which had had 3 different occupants in the intervening time. The letter set for 11 days before someone forwarded it. Colt resigned his position the following month. He told Clara it was burnout. He told her he wanted to do something with his hands, something tangible, something he could see the result of at the end of a day. She had believed him because she trusted him, and because there was no reason not to, and because the thing he had actually done and failed to do was exactly the kind of thing that doesn't show on a face if you've had enough time to arrange the features properly before anyone looks. He moved them to Ironback Creek, bought the ranch, learned the work, and spent 4 years learning that there is no amount of fence fixing or cattle tending that gets rid of a specific name if that name has decided to stay. Reuben Taft. He looked at the woman tied to the post. He looked at the courthouse steps where Devlin Oaks was studying the packed dirt of the road, as though it contained the answers to questions he hadn't quite worked up to asking. He looked at Preston Merritt's silver watch chain, catching the sun with its cheerful, offensive persistence, and something moved in his chest. Not righteousness. He had no confidence in his own righteousness, and hadn't for years. Not heroism. He was 40 years old and tired, and had 14 months of mortgage payments left on land he'd bought to atone for something he'd never told anyone about. Just 2 words, arriving in his chest like something that had been waiting a long time for the right moment to be released. Not again. He stepped down from Button. He didn't announce himself, didn't call across the street, didn't give Preston Merritt or Devlin Oaks or any of the 30 people watching from doorways and windows the time to prepare a response. He just walked across the packed dirt of the main street, past the wagon ruts, past the water trough where Button watched him, with the expression horses get when they've decided something is not their problem and are committed to that position. Preston heard the footsteps when Colt was about 15 feet away, turned not afraid yet, just surprised. The specific surprise of a man who has arranged a room a particular way and someone has walked in and moved the furniture without consulting him. Calloway, Preston said, which was interesting. Colt's name was Deering, not Calloway. Preston had confused him with someone else, a rancher on the South Road named Calloway, who had a similar build and a similar horse, and whom Preston had presumably interacted with at some point over a mortgage matter. The confusion said something specific about how much attention Preston paid to the individual people whose lives his family's system controlled. Not enough to distinguish one gray horse from another. Not enough to remember which man held which debt. Sarah, still at the post, heard it. She filed it away. The way she filed everything, not because she knew yet what it would be useful for, but because a man who doesn't know the name of the person whose land he holds is a man who has been operating entirely through paperwork, and paperwork, she knew, could be challenged. Step away from the post, Colt said. You don't want to involve yourself in. I'm already involved, Colt said. I'm standing here. That's involvement. This is a court matter. She was convicted of theft and slander by Judge Merritt. Her sentence is, I'm not here to discuss the judge. He pulled the knife from his belt, old knife. A working tool, the handle worn down to the specific shape of his grip after years of daily use. He used it every day. Leather, wire, the wrong ends of situations. Nothing ceremonial about it. Nothing dramatic. He walked past Preston Merritt the way you walk past a fence post. Not around, past. Close enough to make the point without requiring an explanation. Stepped around to the back of the shame post and cut the rope. Sarah made a sound when the tension released. Not a cry. Nothing that could be described as breaking. Just an exhale, single, involuntary. The sound a structure makes when the pressure holding it in place is suddenly removed and the structure has to remember how to just be itself again. She stepped away from the post. Her wrists came around in front of her slowly. She pressed them against her stomach, already knowing, without looking, that the left one had been cut by the rope. She turned, looked at the man who had cut it, older than she'd thought from a distance, 40, maybe. A face that had been through weather without apologizing for it. Gray coming in at the temples. Eyes the specific color of creek water in November, not warm, but clear. And direct, ma'am, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, even voice. It cost her something to make it even. She could feel the cost in her throat, in the controlled steadiness, or to keep the word from carrying everything the morning had put into her. He could see the cost, too. It was visible around the edges of the word, but she made it even anyway. because she had decided to, Deering. Sheriff Devlin Oaks came down the courthouse steps with the practiced urgency of a man who has been watching something he should have stopped earlier and is now highly motivated to appear decisive, one hand on his belt. The walk of authority. The voice of someone who has rehearsed the authoritative version of this moment and is delivering it now because the moment has arrived and he doesn't have another version ready. You just cut a court-ordered restraint. That's obstruction of justice. Judge Merritt will have your mortgage note called by nightfall. You understand that? He will take Ironback Creek from you before the sun goes down. Colt turned to look at him. He'd known Devlin Oaks 11 years. He'd attended the man's wedding, a small affair in the spring of 1879. Oaks and a woman named Margaret who'd come from Ohio and who had moved to Ohio 2 years later when it became clear that Stone Falls was going to be what it was going to be. And she had decided she didn't want to watch. He'd watched Oaks sand himself down over 4 years, slowly, the way erosion works. No single day you can point to and say there, that was the day it changed. Just the gradual wearing away of the edges, until the shape of the original thing was no longer quite recognizable. He'd watched Oaks lose pieces of himself so gradually that Oaks himself probably couldn't have told you where each piece had gone. Then he can come and take it, Colt said, from a man who's still standing. The street went quiet, not the natural quiet of an empty place. The electric held breath quiet of 30 people, choosing the same thing at the same time without coordinating, choosing to be still to listen, to let this moment exist without interrupting it. Colt turned back to Sarah. Can you walk? Yes, my horse is at the end of the street. Then I can walk to the end of the street, she said. Matter of fact, no drama in it. The voice of a woman who has decided to be exactly as capable as she is and not perform any excess of either capability or incapability. They walked together. Colt did not take her arm. She hadn't asked for that. He was not in the business of offering what hadn't been requested. He walked beside her, one pace off her left shoulder. Close enough to catch her if her legs decided they were done. Far enough to leave her the dignity of her own weight carrying itself. Preston Merritt shouted something behind them. Neither of them turned. At Button, Colt helped her into the saddle. She needed it. Her arms had less in them than she would have admitted, and the day had been longer than it looked from the outside. He swung up behind her and turned Button north, away from the sign, away from the post, away from the 30 people who had stood in a Kansas street in July and found other things to look at. Behind them, Stone Falls sat in its dust and its practiced looking away, the shame post standing in the center of the square. The painted sign still readable from the road, liar, but the woman it had been built to break was already gone. And in 30 doorways, behind 30 sets of eyes that had found other things to look at all morning, something shifted, not courage, not yet the precursor to it. The faint, dangerous thing that lives in the moment, just before a person decides they are finished being afraid. The thing that starts when one person stops, just one person, walking across a street, cutting a rope. They were a quarter-mile north of town before either of them spoke. The road stretched ahead through dry grass. Heat rising off the packed dirt in waves that made the distance look deceptive. Further than it was, or closer, depending on where you looked, the kind of heat that makes you think you're further along than you are. Budgeon's hooves on the packed earth, the dry grass moving in a hot wind that wasn't doing anything useful about the temperature but was at least in motion. I didn't steal anything, she said. I know, he said. She turned her head slightly. Not all the way, not enough to look at him directly, just enough to catch the edge of his face in her peripheral vision. You don't know me, she said. No, he said. But I know what a person looks like when they've been caught doing something wrong. And I know what a person looks like when they've been told the world has decided to let them burn. He paused. Those are different faces. She was quiet for a moment. His nephew forged the land deeds, she said. Preston. I found them in Judge Merritt's desk drawer when I was cleaning the offices. Property transfers that hadn't happened. Names I recognized. Farming families, people who still believe they own their own land. She paused. And a signature on one of them from a man who died in 1883. Thomas Whitfield, Colt said. She turned her head a little further. You knew him? I knew of him. He had the parcel east of the Henderson place. Died that fall. Fever, they said. They said. She repeated, a silence with weight in it. How many deeds did you see? I read too clearly before Preston came back into the office. There were more in the drawer. I couldn't tell you the names. I was reading fast. She pressed her right hand against her knee, an unconscious movement, checking the left wrist without looking at it directly. Within 2 days of him catching me, the story was that I'd stolen the office payroll and was spreading slander about his family, and Judge Merritt signed off on the post. He painted the sign himself, she said. The woman at the boarding house told me. She watched from her window. Colt said nothing for a moment. He watched the road ahead, the flat brown distance of a Kansas summer that had run out of mercy 3 weeks ago. Merritt holds my mortgage, he said. I assumed, she said. He can call it ours. I know, I'm not telling you that so you'll feel guilty about it, he said. Good, she said, because I wasn't planning to. Despite everything, despite the rope burns and the 3 hours at the post, and the half-day without water in July heat, there was something almost dry in that response. Like a woman who still had the energy to be herself, he found he didn't have anything useful to say to that. So he didn't. I am not asking you to fight my battle, she said, quieter now, more deliberate with the words. I'm asking to be somewhere that isn't that post. While I figure out how to fight it myself. He looked at the back of her head, the dark hair, the escaped pins, the sunburn developing across the back of her neck that was going to hurt considerably by morning. Ironback Creek Ranch, he said. 4 miles north, roughly. All right, it's not much, he said. And then, because comfort without accuracy wasn't something he had much patience for. Hasn't been much for a while. Does it have a roof? It does. Then it's already more than I had an hour ago, she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The Kansas sun pressed down on both of them equally, without preference. Ironback Creek Ranch was exactly what he'd said it was. Sarah saw that the moment they rode through the gate. Not much. Functional. Maintained. But the way you maintain something when maintenance is the only form of control you have left when everything else has been reduced to just keeping the necessary things working. She didn't say anything about it. She was not woman the kind of woman comments on other people's pain without being invited. And a ranch that looked like this one, kept alive by obligation rather than love, was a specific kind of pain she recognized without needing to be told the details. The pain of a place where something used to live that doesn't live there anymore. Inside, Colt set a basin of water on the table, found a cloth, located a tin of wound salve on the shelf and set it down beside the cloth without ceremony. Left wrist, he said. I can manage. Sit down anyway. She sat. She cleaned the rope burn herself, methodically, without reacting to the sting, which told him more about her history than anything she'd said on the ride north. You only stop reacting to pain like that by spending a long time practicing. He went to the other side of the kitchen. Dried beef, he said. Biscuits from this morning. Not much else until I get to town, which, he paused, reorganized the sentence. Which may be a complicated proposition for a while. Because of me. Because of Merritt, he said. Leave that where it belongs. She pressed the cloth against her wrist. Held it. Looked at the table, the grain of the wood, the rings left by 10,000 tin cups set down by hands that weren't setting tin cups down anymore. Whose room was that? She said. The one with the blue curtains at the end of the hall. He went still for exactly 1 beat, then kept moving, cutting the dried beef into portions with the working knife. His hands doing the task his brain had requested. My wife's, he said. She died 2 winters ago. I'm sorry. So am I, he said, simply, without performance. The way a man says a true thing he's had enough time to stop arguing with. You can use that room, he said. Curtains clean. There's a proper bed, she nodded once. She ate when he put food in front of her. Slowly at first, then with the focused efficiency of a body that has been running on empty and has just been given permission to stop. Colt ate standing at the counter, which she noticed, and which she understood. He was a man who had stopped setting 2 places at the table and hadn't found a reason to start again. When she finished, she folded the cloth neatly beside the basin. I need to be clear about something, she said. Go ahead. I'm not here to hide. I understand that's what this might look like. A woman running to the first safe place she found. But that isn't what this is. She met his eyes directly. I was shamed in public for telling the truth. I intend to be cleared in public for the same reason. I am not going to sit quietly somewhere and be grateful until this goes away on its own. Because it won't go away on its own, he said. No. Merritt will make sure of that. He looked at her across the kitchen. At this woman who had spent 3 hours tied to a post in July heat and was now stating her intentions with the precision of someone reading the terms of a contract. I didn't cut you loose so you'd be quiet, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. She slept for 14 hours. He knew because he checked the house twice in the night. Not hovering, the way a man checks on anything wounded that has come into his care. Quick pass. Confirm its breathing. Leave it alone. Both times the ranch was silent. The blue curtains still. He went back to his own room and lay in the dark and thought about mortgage notices. About Devlin Oaks and the particular way the man had looked at the ground when Colt had said what he'd said. Then he can come and take it from a man who's still standing. He hadn't planned that. He wasn't a man who made speeches. Those were just the words that were available, opened his mouth, and he'd used them. But they were out now. In the air of Stone Falls, Merritt had certainly heard about them by sundown. He expected a rider by morning. What he got was Sarah in the kitchen at first light, already dressed, moving with quiet, deliberate purpose, opening cupboard doors, closing them, making some kind of internal accounting. You're out of salt, she said without turning when she heard him in the doorway. I know, and cornmeal. Enough preserved goods for roughly a week if you're eating alone. I'll ride to Harper's Crossing for supplies. Merritt doesn't have reached there. She turned, she looked better. The sunburn still visible across her nose and the back of her neck. But her eyes were clear. She was standing straight in the particular way of someone whose body has been given what it needed and has remembered what it's capable of. Before you go, she said. Sit down, he sat. She had his account ledgers. On the table, 3 of them, oldest to newest, open to pages she'd been marking with a piece of charcoal from the shelf near the stove. How long have you been up, he said. Since 4. That's 2 hours of sleep. I've worked on less. She turned the first ledger to face him, tapped a line near the bottom of the second page. This fee, administrative processing charge, $12, 8 months ago.
Do you remember agreeing to it?
He looked at the number. No, this one, her finger moved. Drought assessment search charge, $9. 6 months ago, there was no. And this, her voice stayed level. The voice of someone reading facts. Just facts. Nothing personal in it yet. Late payment, penalty, $7. For a payment that, according to your own records here, she touched the corresponding entry in the second ledger, was received 4 days before the due date. Colt sat back in his chair. The kitchen was quiet, in the specific way of 2 people looking at the same true thing at the same moment, and neither quite ready to say the word for what they're both seeing. He's been adding to the balance, Colt said slowly. Each word arriving separately, small enough that each one looks like an error, or a fee you forgot agreeing to, or something too small to challenge because who disputes $9 when they owe $200? $28 in 8 months, she said. She closed the ledger. That is not a mistake. That is a method. She looked at him. And you're not the only one he's doing it to. Colt put his hands flat on the table. He was a man who processed things physically. She had already understood this, watching him. The way anger moved through him, and then settled. The way he made himself go still, when what he actually wanted was to be moving. The deeds you saw, he said. The Henderson family, East Road. You said you recognized names. Henderson was one. The other was a name I only half read before Preston came back in. Sounded like Aldred. North Road, maybe. Colt stood, walked to the window, looked out at the ranch, the dry troughs, the thin grass, the south pasture fence he still hadn't gotten to. 14 months of payments remaining. $28 in charges that had never been legitimate. And a judge who had watched Colt ride his convicted woman out of town on horseback yesterday and had been deciding ever since what to do about it. Why tell me this, he said. You could have kept it, used it as leverage later because you cut the rope, she said. Because you are already in this, whether you decided to be or not. And because you have the right to understand the full shape of what you're standing inside, she paused. $28 in false fees is your evidence. It's not enough alone. But combined with what I know and what we can find. We? He said. She looked at him with the patience of someone who has just said something obvious and is waiting for the listener to catch up. We, she said. Before he could respond, they heard it. Hooves on the road. Multiple. Moving with purpose. 2 riders came into the yard at noon. Not official men, just the look of men who work for whoever's paying and ask the minimum number of questions compatible with the job. They rode in without slowing, until the horse's breath was audible through the kitchen window. Colt came out the front door. Before they could dismount, Deering, the furrier, had a broad face and a flat voice. Judge Merritt wants it known that the woman you removed from court custody remains under a lawful sentence. Harboring her constitutes. She's a guest on private property, Colt said. She's a convicted party who abandoned her sentence. Her sentence was tying a woman to a post in 100-degree heat without water. That's not a sentence. That's something else. And we both know the word for it. The second rider, younger, not quite at home in the weight of the errand, shifted in his saddle. Judge Merritt can call your note, the first man said. Full balance. 48 hours. I understood that yesterday. The sheriff said it, Colt said. My answer's the same. He stepped off the porch, into the yard. On the same level as the horses. Tell him this, Colt said. If any man sets foot on Ironback Creek land without an invitation, if my fences get cut, if my cattle get moved, if anything on this property is disturbed in any way, I will ride to the federal land office and file a formal complaint about the accounting irregularities in his mortgage records. And I will bring documentation. The first rider looked at him. What documentation? The kind a man finds when he looks at his own ledgers carefully enough, Colt said. Tell him that. Specifically, a pause. The first rider looked past Colt's shoulder, to the doorway where Sarah had appeared, standing in the frame, arms at her sides. Not retreating, at the woman. The rider said, That's my guest, Colt said. The riders exchanged a look. The first one turned his horse. Merritt won't let this sit, he said. Neither will I, Colt said. He watched them ride back down the road. When they were gone, he turned. Sarah spoke first. You mentioned documentation. I did. Do you have documentation? I have my ledgers. Your testimony. Whatever you remember about those deed records, he paused. It's not enough yet, but he doesn't know exactly what we have. And that uncertainty is worth something. She was quiet. We need witnesses, she said. Yes. People who saw things. People Merritt has been holding over something. People who've been staying quiet because there was nobody standing next to them. When they tried to speak, she paused. That's how his system works. Isolation. One person at a time, each one believing they're the only one. Too afraid to find out if that's true. That's a dangerous thing to ask of people, Colt said. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not asking them to be brave for nothing. I'm asking them to be brave for each other. One person's truth is a claim. 11 people's truth is a record. She held his gaze. Do you trust me? The question landed differently than he expected, not because it was inappropriate, because it was so direct, and because answering it honestly required him to check something inside himself he hadn't examined in 4 years. "Yes," he said. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. "Tonight? I want to fix your south fence before someone finishes cutting it, and your cattle end up somewhere that isn't your property." He looked at her. "I can work," she said. "No apology. I don't doubt that." "Good," she said. "Then stop looking like you do." They worked the south fence until the light failed. She handled wire with the efficiency of someone who has spent years doing physical labor that nobody paid much attention to. The invisible work. The kind that keeps everything else from falling apart, performed by people who are thanked for it approximately never. She didn't talk while she worked, neither did he. They developed a rhythm without discussing it. The specific kind of compatibility that cannot be manufactured, only discovered, usually accidentally, in the middle of something that actually matters. When they stopped, they sat on a flat rock near the south boundary and passed canteen back and forth and watched the Kansas sky do what it does in July evenings. Turn colors that seem almost deliberately extravagant for a landscape that spends its days attempting to kill everything in it. Deep orange, then something close to red, then the particular purple that lasts exactly long enough to notice before it's gone. She would have stopped, Colt said, after a while. Sarah looked at him. "My wife," he said. "Clara. She would never have sat on that horse and weighed the options the way I did. She would have been down and walking toward you before I finished the first calculation." "You did stop," Sarah said. "It took too long. You still stopped." She looked at him steadily. "Most people never do. Not once." "Not for anyone." He set the canteen on the rock. One of the cattle made a long, low sound across the south field. Another answered from somewhere in the dark. Then the ranch went quiet again. The specific quiet of a working place at rest. Not empty, just paused. "You said you saw the deeds 3 weeks ago," he said. "He hired me to clean the offices twice a week. I needed the income." She pressed her right hand against her knee. That gesture again, checking the left wrist without looking at it. "I was hired through Preston," which I understand now was intentional. If Preston controls the payment record, he controls whether anyone believes I was ever legitimately there. "Convenient," Colt said. "Very carefully designed." She looked out at the dark pasture. The deed for the Henderson land had a transfer dated 6 months ago. Martin Henderson has 3 children and a wife who has been sick most of this year. He is out there right now, making payments every month, believing that land is his and it isn't, Colt said. "Not according to the altered records. Not according to anything that would stand up in a federal proceeding." The weight of that sat between them. The specific weight of a wrong that is completely invisible to the person it's being done to. Colt stood, picked up the tools, looked north toward the ranch house, where a single lamp burned in the kitchen window. She had left it on. Before they came out, he hadn't done that. Left a light on in the kitchen window. "Ezra Nance," he said. She looked at him. "Who? Widow. 73 years old. Stone cottage at the end of Mill Road. She tried to bring you water at the post this morning." Merritt's man turned her back. He paused. "She's been in Stone Falls longer than Merritt has been in this state. She remembers what this town looked like before his system, and she has nothing left for him to threaten. She stopped being afraid of losing things around all the time her husband died. There's a specific kind of freedom in that. You think she saw something. I think she sees everything," Colt said. "She always has. That's what happens when you're old enough that people stop performing for you." Sarah stood slowly, looking north toward the lit window. "Ike Callum," she said. Quiet, almost to herself. "The stable boy at Merritt's livery, yes. He was there the night the payroll went missing. Preston would have needed a horse readied. And Ike is always in that stable." She looked at Colt. Preston threatened him. I saw it in the boy's face, the way it changed every time Preston walked past. That's not nerves. That's a person who knows something they've been told they'll regret saying. He's 15 years old, Colt said. If Merritt thinks he's talking, which is why we reach him before Merritt realizes we're building anything. She met his eyes. Tomorrow, Ezra first, then Ike, then whoever Ike leads us to, Colt nodded once. They walked back toward the ranch house in the dark, the lamp in the window getting larger as they got closer. Neither of them said anything else that evening. But the lamp burned on until well past midnight, not because either of them was still awake, because for the first time in 2 years, Colt Deering had forgotten to put it out. And in Stone Falls. In the back office of the courthouse, where the good lamps burned on imported oil and the ledgers lived behind a locked door, Judge Aldous Merritt sat across from his nephew and said, in the quiet, measured voice of a man who has not been seriously challenged in a very long time, find out who she's spoken to. Find out what she thinks she has. Preston leaned back, still comfortable. Still wearing the expression of a man who has not yet fully processed that the situation has changed. And then, he said. And then I want that ranch, Merritt said. The mortgage is 14 months from paid. Call it in now, and he loses everything Clara Deering died, believing she was building. He paused. Do it this week? Preston nodded, already picturing the outcome, already seeing the end of the story as he understood it. Neither of them considered, even briefly, that by morning the woman they were discussing would be at the kitchen table in that dying ranch house, 3 ledgers open in front of her, the name of every person she needed written in her own careful hand. That she had been awake for 2 hours before either of them. That she had not wasted a single one. Ezra Nance answered the door before they knocked, not almost before. Before. She was already standing in the open frame when they came up the path, shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. Brown eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Looking at Sarah, the way a person looks at someone they have been expecting for a while, and are simply relieved has finally arrived. I watched them take you to that post, Ezra said. No greeting. No preamble. Just that. I tried to bring you water. Her jaw tightened at the memory. Merritt's man, the young one with the red vest, told me if I came within 10 feet of you, he'd have my property assessed for back taxes by morning. I know, Sarah said. I saw you. Which was true. She had memorized every face, including the ones that tried and were turned back. Those mattered differently from the ones that didn't try at all. Come in, Ezra said. Both of you. Close that behind you. The cottage was small and ordered, and dense with the particular weight of a life lived long in one place without apology for taking up space. Photographs on every surface, embroidered cloths on the chairs, a shelf of medicine bottles arranged by size, a Bible on the side table worn to softness at the spine, not from performance but from actual use, which is a different thing, and you can see the difference if you know what to look for. Ezra moved to her chair and settled into it with the deliberate care of a woman whose knees have opinions about stairs. She folded her hands in her lap. What do you need? She said. Not a question. A transaction opening, what you saw, Sarah said. All of it. Ezra was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Colt counted, because the silence felt like something being weighed. The night the payroll went missing, Ezra said. That was a Thursday. I know because Thursday is when I do my mending. I was up late. My lamp oil was running low, and I wanted to finish the collar on my good dress before it ran out. She paused. I heard a horse. One horse. Moving fast down the back alley behind the courthouse. That alley runs directly past my side window. I looked out. What time? Colt said. Past midnight. Closer to 1. The payroll went missing between 10 and midnight, Sarah said. The foreman reported it the next morning. I know what time it was, Ezra said, without irritation, just precision. I also know Preston Merritt's horse, gray roan, white marking on the left foreleg. He has ridden past this cottage enough times in 3 years that I could identify that animal in complete darkness. By the sound of its gait, she looked at Colt. He was moving fast. He was carrying something, and he did not want to be seen. How certain are you? Colt said. Ezra looked at him the way very old women look at men who ask questions they consider mildly insulting. I am certain, she said. What I am not is believed. There is a difference, and in this town, that difference has been managed very carefully by a man who controls what gets written down. Sarah leaned forward. We are building toward a moment where that management ends, she said. We need you willing to say what you just said, in public. When the time comes, the clock on Ezra's shelf ticked once, twice, 3 times. He threatened my cottage. She said, I know. I am 73 years old. I have nowhere else to go, Ezra. Sarah's voice dropped, steady, but with something warmer underneath. If we do this correctly, if the truth comes out from enough people at once, rather than one person alone, Merritt loses the ability to punish anyone individually. He cannot evict everyone. He cannot destroy everyone. His power depends on each person believing they are the only one. That is what we are taking away. Ezra looked at her for a long time. Then at Colt, you believe her, she said. Yes, you're putting your ranch on this. I already did that when I cut the rope, Colt said. I'm not going back. Ezra unfolded her hands, placed them flat on her knees. The cufflink, she said. Sarah went still. What cufflink? Preston lost a cufflink that week. Silver, blue stone. He was asking around about it, trying to seem casual, which he is not good at. Every shop, every stable hand. Anyone who might have found it along the back alley, she paused. The stable boy found it. Ike Callum. I saw the boy with it 2 days after the theft. He didn't know what to do with it. He looked not confused. Terrified, Colt and Sarah looked at each other. One of those looks that doesn't need words. Does Ike still have it? Sarah said. Unless Preston found out and took it from him, Ezra said. Which God help that child is possible. The livery stable sat at the south end of Stone Falls, past the feed store, tucked against the back wall of the blacksmith's shop, smelling of horses and old hay and the particular oil that gets worked into leather over years of use. At this hour of the morning it was quiet. One of the hands visible through the open main doors, forking hay to the loft with the automatic rhythm of a person whose body has done this so many times it no longer asks the brain for instructions. Ike Callum was not in the loft. He was in the tack room at the back, 15 years old, sitting on an upturned bucket with a piece of harness leather in his hands, stitching a repair with the focused concentration of someone using the task to avoid thinking about something that lives in the same head as the task. He looked up when Sarah came through the door. His face did 3 things in about 2 seconds. Recognition, fear, and then the particular guilt of someone carrying information they haven't shared and know they should have. I know why you're here, he said, which was interesting because Sarah hadn't said anything yet. Tell me, she said. Preston said he stopped, looked at the harness. He said if I told anyone what I saw that night, he'd tell his uncle I'd been stealing from the stable. That no one would believe me over him, because of who his family is. He swallowed. He said the judge could have me sent to the reformatory in Wichita. A pause. Then Colt. From the doorway. He said all of that to a 15-year-old boy, not a question. Not outrage performing itself for an audience. Just a man, stating a fact and letting the weight of it sit in the air without decoration. Ike looked at him. Most boys who worked in small western towns had a particular awareness of Colt Deering, a rancher known more by reputation than by contact. Man who paid his hands fairly. Didn't raise his voice. Yes, sir, Ike said. What did you see? Sarah said. The boy was quiet for long enough that the horse in the nearest stall shifted its weight and blew air through its nose. Then he set the harness down. I sleep in the back stall sometimes when it's hot, he said. My room above the feed store doesn't get any air in summer. He looked at his hands. That Thursday I was here. I heard Preston bring in his horse around 1 in the morning, which wasn't right. He doesn't ride at night. He doesn't like the dark. It makes him jumpy. He paused. He was moving fast. He took something out of his saddlebag, wrapped it in a feed cloth and pushed it behind the loose board. In the third tall, I didn't look at what it was. I didn't want him to know I was there. But the next morning that board had been moved. Whatever was behind it was gone. He reached into the front pocket of his work pants, brought out a small object. Silver blue stone in a clean setting, exactly as Ezra had described. He held it in his open palm and looked at it the way you look at something that is both worthless and impossibly heavy at the same time. He dropped it in the stall, Ike said. I picked it up. I didn't know what to do with it. So I kept it. A pause. That was probably stupid. No, Sarah said. Quiet. Careful. That was the right thing. Even when you didn't know why. Ike closed his fingers around the cufflink. If I say this in front of people, he said, in front of the judge, what happens to me? You don't say it alone, Sarah said. That's the whole point. When you stand up, there will be enough people standing beside you that Merritt cannot reach any single one of us without reaching all of us at once. And if he tries, everyone in that town sees exactly what he is. And if it goes wrong? Colt looked at the boy steadily. Keep that cufflink on your person, he said. Not in this stable, not in your room, on your person. And stay away from Preston until we tell you it's time. Ike nodded slowly. The kind of nod that isn't agreement yet. Just the beginning of considering it. He looked younger than 15 for a moment, then older than 40. All right, he said. Dorsey Fane was harder. She opened her door 4 inches and looked at Sarah, through the gap, with the eyes of a woman who has run the same risk calculation so many times that caution has become the factory setting of her face. I know why you're here, she said. Then you know what I'm going to ask, Sarah said. I know what you're going to ask. Dorsey's voice was low, careful, each word placed before the next, like stepping stones over uncertain water. And I know what happens to me if Merritt finds out, I answered. I have a laundry business. It's small. It's mine. It took me 7 years to build it after my husband died. She stopped. He could pull my water permit. He could claim this property sits on disputed land. He could have the sheriff citing me for violations that didn't exist yesterday and won't exist the day after he's made his point. All of that is true, Sarah said. So you're asking me to hand him the means. I'm asking you to help make sure he never gets to use them. Dorsey looked past Sarah at Colt, at the space around them, at the empty street that wasn't quite as empty as it looked. You washed Preston's coat, Sarah said, the morning after the payroll went missing. What was on it? The gap in the door held 4 inches. Exactly 4. Then Dorsey said, blood on the right cuff. Not a lot, but deliberate. The kind that comes from a cut, not an accident. Like he'd dragged his arm along something sharp in the dark. She stopped, and the left sleeve was torn at the elbow, caught on something. A nail or a post corner. From the angle of the tear, she paused. I have washed that man's clothes for 2 years. I know his garments the way I know my own. That was Preston Merritt's coat, and that blood was fresh when I got it. Why didn't you say anything? Colt said. Because there was no one to say it to, Dorsey said, flat, without self-pity, just the fact of it. And because the man I'd be saying it about is the nephew of the man who decides what gets recorded in this county. She looked at Sarah. You're building something, she said. Yes, how many people? 4 including you. More coming. The door moved. 2 more inches. Come in, Dorsey said, and tell me exactly what you're planning. All of it. Gideon Solt was the color of old bread. That was the first thing Colt noticed when Sarah laid out what she knew in the back room of Solt's general store. The door closed. No customers. Mid-morning on a Wednesday. Old bread. Slightly gray. The color a man goes when something he has been trying not to think about for 3 months is suddenly sitting on a table in front of him in plain light. The morning after, Sarah said, Preston came in, paid for goods. How much? What denomination? Solt looked at his hands. Gold coins, he said. 3 of them. Specific denominations, not the kind you get in regular trade. The kind that end up in a payroll envelope. He stopped. I recorded the transaction. I have it in the ledger. He looked up. I have known, since the day I wrote it down, what those coins were, and you said nothing, Colt said. Not accusation. Just the sentence. Solt flinched anyway. "He holds my mortgage," he said. "He holds everyone's." "I know," Colt said. "I know exactly what he holds." The room was quiet. Solt looked at Sarah, at the ledgers she'd brought, at the list of names written in her careful hand. "If I bring that ledger page," he said, "if I stand up in public and show it." "You won't be standing alone," Sarah said. "That is the only way this works." Together or not at all. Solt looked at the table for a long moment. Then, "I'll write a formal statement," signed. Tonight, which was more than she'd asked for. Which told Colt something about what 3 months of guilt does to a person when they're finally given somewhere to put it down. They had 5 witnesses now: Ezra, Ike, Dorsey, Solt, and the evidence from Colt's own ledgers. $28 in fraudulent fees, documented in his own hand before Merritt had to explain them away. Not enough, Sarah knew it. She sat with the ledgers spread across the kitchen table that Wednesday evening and ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers, systematically, without sentiment, until the picture they formed was clear. Not enough to take to a local courthouse, because the local courthouse was Merritt's enough, maybe, for a federal complaint. If they had original land documents that predated Merritt's alterations. If they had something with an official seal that said, "This is what the record said," before someone started changing them. "Warren Holt," Colt said. She looked up. He was standing at the window. The lamp on the table threw his shadow long across the kitchen floor. "Former county recorder," he said. "Merritt replaced him in the spring of 1884. Lives east of town now. Small farm." Merritt pushed him out by making the position unworkable. Budget cuts, questions about his record-keeping, eventually just appointed his own man. Sarah set down her charcoal pencil. "Did Holt keep copies?" she said. "He told me something once," Colt said. "Over a drink in Harper's Crossing, where he felt safe enough to talk. He said a man in his position would be a fool not to keep copies of everything he certified. Said someday, someone was going to need to see what the record said before Merritt's man started revising them." The kitchen was very quiet. "If Holt has original certified records," Sarah said, slowly, each word deliberate, "records that predate the alterations, then the forgeries are provable," Colt said. "Not suspected, provable." In a federal proceeding, neither of them spoke, just looked at each other across the table, and then the sound came from outside. Not riders. Something lower, faster, multiple hooves at the pace of urgency. The specific rhythm that means something has already gone wrong by the time you're hearing it. Colt was at the door before Sarah had fully identified what she was hearing. He came back inside with his jaw set. 4 words. "They're moving the cattle." The south pasture fence had been cut in 2 places. Clean cuts, a tool, not a break from pressure. Deliberate gaps wide enough for animals to move through in numbers. 3 riders on horseback were working the edge of the herd, pushing them south, toward the dry ravine along the bottom of the property line. A drop of maybe 15 feet onto rock. Not fatal, if they were lucky. Bad enough, if they weren't. The cattle knew it. That's the thing about cattle in a panic. They know when the direction they're being pushed is wrong. And the sound they make when they know it is a sound that gets into your chest and doesn't leave quickly. Colt went left, because that was where the break was worst. Sarah went right. She didn't ask, didn't wait for direction. She had grown up on working ranches, Apache camps that moved with the seasons, that required every person to understand their role and execute it without being told. She understood cattle movement the way she understood ledger columns, the whole picture, where things were flowing, the exact point where the flow needed to be redirected. She got ahead of the right flank and turned them. It took everything she had, voice, arms, the full insistence of her body placed between panicked animals and a 15-foot drop onto rock. It was loud and physical and not graceful in any way. One of the cattle caught her shoulder with its head on a hard turn and put her on one knee in the dry grass. She was back up before the knee had time to register what had happened, because there was no time. Colt had turned the left flank. The three riders pulled up, reconsidering, because this was not going the way they'd planned. They had expected one man, managing a cattle push alone, in the dark. Not a woman working the other side, with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this before and is not going to stop. The third rider pushed harder on Colt's side. Colt moved button directly in front of the other horse. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Just there, immovable. The body language of a man who has decided the outcome and is waiting for the other person to catch up with that fact. The rider pulled up. Colt looked at him. "Tell Merritt," he said, "that he doesn't have enough men." The three of them left, taking their time about it to make it look like their choice, but they left. Colt found Sarah at the edge of the south field, breathing hard. Dress filthy from the knee down. Left shoulder held at an angle that suggested the collision with the cattle had formed an opinion that would express itself more clearly by morning. She was checking the gap in the fence with her hands, running her fingers along the cut edges, assessing the damage the way a person assesses something they are already planning to fix. "You're bleeding," Colt said. "It's nothing, Sarah." She turned. A cut above her right eyebrow. Not deep, but head cuts don't need to be deep to commit to the job. She pressed the back of her hand against it. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. But there was something behind it tonight that wasn't steadiness. The thing that lives just behind steadiness, in a person who has been pushed past their limit and is refusing to acknowledge it. The thing that shows up in the eyes before the voice gives any sign. "Come here," he said. He pulled the cloth from his vest pocket without asking, pressed it gently against the cut above her eye, and Sarah went still, not flinching, not pulling back, just still. The way a person goes still when they have been managing everything at full tension for 3 days, and someone does something careful and it catches them off guard. For one moment, just one. The steadiness slipped, and what was underneath it was not weakness, was not collapse, was exhaustion. Real exhaustion, 3 days of it. And underneath that, something older. The weight of being a person who has learned to manage everything alone because the alternative has not consistently been available. He didn't say anything about it because some things are not helped by being named. They're only helped by being witnessed. He held the cloth against her head until the bleeding slowed. They stood like that for a moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm. The night air carrying the smell of dry grass and cattle and the mineral smell of Kansas earth that hasn't had rain in 3 weeks. Neither of them moved away. "I told you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I'm not here to hide, I know," he said. "Today proved it." "Yes," he said. "It did." He stepped back, handed her the cloth. She held it against her own head and looked at the pasture, the cattle settling now in the dark, the gap in the fence ugly against the failing light. "They'll come back," she said. "Probably tomorrow night, then we move faster than he expects." She lowered the cloth. The bleeding had slowed to almost nothing. "Holt, tomorrow morning." "Early. We go together," Colt said. She looked at him. "You don't have." "I know I don't." He met her eyes directly. "I want to." Something moved in her face, not softening exactly. More like the recognition of something that was there and is only now being acknowledged. She looked back at the fence. "We need to fix this before we go in," she said. "Sephra." "After the fence," she said. He almost smiled. "After the fence," he agreed. They repaired the gap by lantern light. The rhythm came back without discussion, which was itself a kind of information. The specific ease of people who have already learned how the other one works and don't need to relearn it. She didn't talk while she worked. Neither did he. But this time the silence was different from the first time. The first time they had been two people finding out if they could do this together. This time they already knew. And knowing changed the texture of the quiet into something more settled. More like the silence of people who have already said the necessary things and are now simply occupying the same space without performance. When they finished, Sarah stood back and looked at the repaired gap, then at the sky, Kansas sky in July evenings, turning colors that seem almost deliberately extravagant for a landscape that spends its days attempting to kill everything in it. "Tell me something about the first time you came to Ironback Creek," she said. He looked at her. "Clara picked the spot," he said. "I was thinking about water access and southern exposure." She was thinking about the way the light hit the cottonwood trees at 4 in the afternoon. He paused. "We had an argument about it that lasted 3 days. She won." Obviously, Sarah said. "She was right about the light," he said. "I still can't fault her on the light." "She would have stopped," he said after a moment. "Before I did. At the post. She would have been across that street and cutting the rope before I finished the first calculation." "But you did it," Sarah said. "Eventually. Too slowly. You still did it." She looked at him, the lantern between them throwing shadows both directions. "Most people never do. Not once. Not for anyone." He looked at the fence they'd just repaired. "She used to say," he said, "that the measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy. It's what they do when the calculation comes out against them, and they do it anyway." Serapha was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth arguing with for 3 days," she said. "She was," he said. "She really was." They rode to Warren Holt's farm before sunup the next morning. Sarah had slept 3 hours. Colt knew because she was already in the kitchen. Before 4, the ledgers open, making notes by the light of the lamp she'd left burning. He handed her coffee without comment. She drank it standing. "Holt," she said. "I know," he said. "Let's go." Warren Holt was 54 years old, lean, deliberate. The careful bearing of a former official who has spent 2 years being nobody in particular and hasn't fully decided whether that's a relief or a defeat. He opened his door at first light and looked at Colt, then at Sarah, then at the ledgers she was carrying. Something shifted in his face, the way attention shifts when something you've been waiting for, without knowing exactly what form it would take, finally comes up the front path. "Come in," he said. "I'll get the box." The box was a wooden crate stored under the floor of the back room, wrapped in oilcloth, lifted out with careful handling of something stored precisely because it matters. Not because you knew when, but because you knew it would. It contained 11 years of county land records. Everything Warren Holt had certified during his tenure as county recorder. Every transfer, every deed registration, every mortgage filing. Copied carefully before Merritt's appointed replacement came in and began the slow revision of what the official records said. Holt spread them on the table. Sarah set her ledgers beside them, open to the pages she'd marked. For the next 40 minutes, nobody spoke except to ask a question or confirm a number. She worked through the records the way she worked through everything. Systematically, without hurry, looking for the place where a false entry makes the one mistake it can't avoid. Because false entries always make one mistake. The date that contradicts the signature. The transfer language that uses legal form without legal habit. The notation that a genuine recorder would never write, because they'd learned, through years of practice, that the shorthand means something different in proceedings than it looks on paper. She found 6 consistencies in the first 20 minutes. Holt found 4 more. He started in the spring of 1884, she said, her voice very level, very controlled. "Your replacement was in the office for less than 6 weeks before the first altered transfer appears." She turned a page, then another. "Henderson. The Aldred Farm. A parcel on the eastern edge of the county." She stopped. "Looked up, Mr. Holt. These families are making mortgage payments on land they no longer legally own. According to the altered documents, the title's transferred to a holding company controlled by Merritt's office. He has been collecting those payments while simultaneously holding the deeds. He is receiving money twice. For the same land." Holt sat back, the specific expression of a man who has suspected something and has just been told it is worse than he suspected. "He's stealing the land twice," Holt said. "Yes. Taking the payments and taking the property. Yes. That is a federal crime. Multiple counts, Sarah said, which is why I need your records, not copies, originals, with your certification seal, the records that show what this county looked like. Before his man started making adjustments, Holt looked at the box. Then at Colt. If I hand these over, he said, and something goes wrong. It won't go wrong, Colt said. Not anymore. We have 5 witnesses, physical evidence. And now your records. How can you be certain? Because 11 people are already in, Sarah said. You make 12. And 12 people saying the same true thing at the same time is something different from one person saying it alone. She held his eyes. And we have market day. Holt looked at her. Market day. 4 days from now. Every rancher, farmer, merchant, and family in 20 miles comes into Stone Falls. Every person Merritt has been stealing from will be in that square at the same time. She paused. We don't go to a closed hearing in his courthouse. We go to the square, in public, where he cannot control the audience, where the truth lands on the people it belongs to, at the same time it lands on him. Holt looked at the box. 11 years of mornings he had come in early to certify documents before the day's business started. 11 years of knowing exactly what each signature meant and making sure it meant that. 11 years of a job he had done correctly, wrapped in oilcloth under a floorboard, waiting for this exact moment. He had not known it was waiting. But it had been. Take the originals, he said. Every page with my seal. All of it. They were halfway back to Ironback Creek when Colt said, He'll know we went to Holt. Yes, she said. He'll move on Ike, which is why we're riding into Stone Falls before we go home. He looked at her. In broad daylight, he said. Especially in broad daylight. She shifted the box of records against her saddle. The worst thing we can do right now is disappear. Let Merritt think he's contained the problem. He needs to see us. He needs to feel the clock moving against him. Pressure makes people make mistakes. She paused. And Ike needs to know to stay away from that stable tonight. They rode into Stone Falls at 9 in the morning. The effect was not dramatic. It was subtler than that, and more significant because of it. Colt felt it, the awareness moving through the town like current through water. The invisible adjustment of people who have been watching a situation and are suddenly presented with new information and have to recalibrate. Sarah, publicly shamed 4 days ago, convicted by the county judge, tied to a post in the main street, was riding back into Stone Falls, spine straight, chin level, a wooden crate of records across her saddle, and the man who had cut her loose from the shame post riding beside her. Neither of them looked like people who were managing anything carefully. They looked like people who had somewhere to be. Solt appeared in his doorway, started to step back, caught himself, stepped forward instead, stayed there. Ezra Nance was at her gate on Mill Road. She gave Sarah a single nod, small, precise. Sarah nodded back. They found Ike behind the feed store, sitting on a water barrel in the shadow of the building, doing nothing with the focused determination of someone trying. Very hard to look like they're doing nothing. Sarah dismounted and walked to him directly. Go to Ezra. Nance's cottage tonight, she said. Quiet. Fast. Don't go back to the stable after dark. Ike looked toward the courthouse building. Preston was asking about me this morning, he said. I heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice. I know. That's why you're going to Ezra's. What about the cufflink? Keep it on your body. Not in a pocket that can be searched, on your person. She looked at him. 3 days. Market day. Can you hold 3 days? Yes, ma'am. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. Just that. Brief. But direct. Good man, she said. And meant it. Not as performance. Not as encouragement designed to manage him. As a statement of what she actually believed. Ike's shoulders changed. Something in the set of them. Like a small weight redistributed somewhere more manageable. She turned back to Button, found Colt, watching her with that expression she'd seen twice now, the one more complicated than admiration, and not quite something she had a word for, yet. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You keep saying nothing when it's clearly something. You're very good at that, he said. talking to people. Making the thing you're asking feel possible. I spent 3 years in Missouri. Being told my judgment wasn't required by people who needed my judgment to run their office, she said, taking Button's reins. I learned to speak in ways that worked on other people's terms, because mine weren't going to be accepted. It turns out that's useful for more than one purpose. She put her foot in the stirrup. Now let's move before Merritt looks out his window. They were nearly to the north end of the main street when Sheriff Devlin Oaks stepped out of his office. He stood on the boardwalk and looked at them. For a moment, nobody moved. Oaks looked tired in a way that went past the physical. The tiredness of a man who has been making the wrong choices for long enough that he can no longer clearly remember what the right ones felt like. He looked at Sarah. Miss. His voice was careful. Neutral. Judge Merritt filed additional charges this morning. Property interference. He's claiming you directed the damage to Deering's fence line 2 nights ago. For damage done by Merritt's own men, Colt said. Which I know, Oak said. Because I know which men rode south that night. None of them work for her, he stopped. I'm telling you so you know what's been filed. Sarah looked at him steadily. Then you know he's lying, she said. I know a number of things, Oak said. I have known a number of things for 2 years that I have not done anything useful with, he stopped again. Seemed to be working out how much of a longer sentence to actually say. I am not telling you I'm ready to walk into that courthouse, he said. I am not making any kind of promise. What I am saying is, he paused, market day, if there are enough people standing in that square. If the truth comes out in a way he can't manage, he stopped. I am telling you I know where I should have been standing for the past 2 years then. Stand there on market day, Sarah said. That's all I'm asking. Just be there. Oaks looked at Colt. 11 years, a town changing around them, a gradual erosion. The specific math of what you lose when you let things go one small compromise at a time and don't look at the total until someone puts it in front of you. I'm not making promises, Oak said. You don't have to, Sarah said. Just don't be somewhere else, she rode on. Colt followed. Behind them, Devlin Oaks stood on the boardwalk for a long time after they were gone, looking at the courthouse across the street, looking at the spaces where the shame post had been, looking at something that existed in neither of those places, but somewhere in the distance between who he had been when he came to Stone Falls and who he had quietly become. The second unexpected thing happened that same evening. Colt was doing final repairs on the south fence when he saw the rider coming from the east road, not Merritt's men. A woman on a brown horse, moving at the pace of someone who has made a decision after a long time spent avoiding it and is now committed. Clara Aldred, Martin Aldred's wife. The woman whose land, according to Holt's records, and Sarah's cross-referencing that morning, had been secretly transferred to Merritt's holding company 14 months ago, without a word to either of them. She dismounted at the gate. Is she here? She said. The Apache woman. Inside, Colt said. I need to speak with her. She reached into her coat, brought out a folded paper. I found this in Martin's papers. He didn't understand what it was, but I kept accounts for my father's grain business for 9 years before I married Martin. She looked at the paper. I understand exactly what it is. Inside. Clara sat across from Serapha at the kitchen table, put the paper between them. Sarah opened it. A notice, printed on Merritt's courthouse letterhead, signed by his appointed recorder. 30 days to vacate the Aldred property. Grounds. Delinquent payment to the new deed holder. A company name that meant nothing. 3 words, and a number, the kind of name designed to be unmemorable to the people being stolen from. He sent this to Martin yesterday, Clara said. Her voice was controlled. Her hands were flat on the table and trembling, not from weakness, but from the specific effort of maintaining control when what you actually want to do is something else entirely. Martin thinks he missed a payment. He's been going through every record we have trying to find his mistake. Because that is what Martin does when something goes wrong. He looks for his own error first. She stopped. There is no error. Is there? No, Sarah said. The land was transferred 2 years ago. Without your knowledge, he's been paying a mortgage on land that is no longer legally registered in your name, Sarah said, according to the altered records. Yes, and we're not the only ones. No, you're not. Clara looked at the paper on the table. Then she looked up. Her eyes were completely different from the eyes she'd walked in with. The woman who had come in afraid had just become something else. Somewhere in the 30 seconds between hearing the confirmation and looking up, the fear had converted itself into something with more structural integrity. "What do you need from me?" she said. By the evening before market day, 11 people had told Sarah they would be in that square. Not all of them could speak. Some could only stand. Some could only be present, which was itself a form of testimony in a town where presence had cost people things. But 11 people had said they would not be somewhere else, which was 11 more than Merritt knew about. He said the name out loud at midnight, alone in his room, no lamp. Just the dark and the sound of the ranch settling around him, the way old buildings settle. Wood and stone adjusting to the temperature, to the hour, to the weight of what lives inside them. Reuben Taft, 2 words. Said out loud for the first time in 4 years. Nobody heard it. The walls heard it. Button heard it maybe, from the stable. But Button had the good sense not to have opinions about things that weren't his business. Colt lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling he couldn't see. Because tomorrow he was going to stand in the center of Stone Falls and tell the truth about something. And before he did that, before he asked anyone else to be brave in public, he needed to practice being honest in private. So, Reuben Taft, 1881. The evidence Colt had found and chosen not to use. The calculation he'd made that had felt, in the moment, like pragmatism, and had been, every single day since, the specific weight that pragmatism leaves behind when you were wrong about what you were protecting. He said the name one more time, not for forgiveness. He wasn't expecting that, for accuracy. Because some things need to be said out loud, before you are qualified to say the things that matter. Sarah was in the kitchen before 4. He knew because he heard her, the specific quiet movement of someone trying not to wake a house while the house is already awake. The soft sound of a lamp being turned up. He got up, made coffee, set a cup in front of her without comment. She was already dressed, already looking at the records, the list of names, the order of events. She'd arranged and rearranged till it was exactly right. She looked up when he set the cup down, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. "You ready?" she said. "Yes," he said, which was not entirely accurate, but accurate enough to build on. "Then let's goes," she said. The night before market day, Colt had found Sarah at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. The records spread in front of her in the order she intended to present them, the witness list. Holt's certified originals arranged by date, by property, by specific discrepancy. She was not reviewing. She was sitting still, hands in her lap, looking at the table with an expression that told him she was somewhere other than the kitchen. He sat down across from her without asking. She looked up. "I keep thinking about the post," she said. He waited. "Not the pain of it," she said. "Pain I've had before. It was the..." Looking away, she paused. 30 people who walked past and found other things to look at. "I understand the fear. I know exactly why each of them did it. But there is something about being looked away from." She stopped. "It goes somewhere inside you. Somewhere that doesn't heal at the same rate as the skin." "Sarah," he said. "I'm all right," she said immediately. "I know you are." He looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the kitchen quiet. "I see you," he said. "Whatever I'm worth at this particular point in my life, which has been under negotiation for a couple of years now, I see who you are, and I am glad you ended up at this table." She looked at him for a moment. The 2 in the morning light, the specific honesty of that hour, the way it makes performances feel more expensive than they're worth. "When this is over," she said. Not a complete sentence, just the beginning of one. "When this is over," he agreed. She looked back at the records. Straightened the top page. We need to be in town before 8. Before Merritt positions himself on the courthouse steps. I'll have the horses ready at 7. Colt, he stopped. She was looking at the table, not at him. Thank you. Not for the rope, she paused, chose. For not making me smaller than I am. He looked at her for a moment. That was never going to be something I did, he said. And went to bed. And in Stone Falls. In the back office of the courthouse, Merritt received the report from his rider, the one he'd sent to watch the road north, and learned that Colt Deering and the Apache woman had been to Warren Holt's farm. He was quiet for a long time after hearing it. She has Holt's records, he said. It appears so, sir. He turned to Preston. The cufflink, he said. Preston's expression changed. You told me you found it, Merritt said. I looked. The boy said he hadn't. The boy lied. Merritt said quietly. Which means the boy has it. Which means she already knows about the boy. He closed the ledger. I want that cufflink before morning. And I want to know where Ike Callum is sleeping tonight. Preston stood. One more thing, Merritt said. His voice very quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has maintained a system for 4 years by understanding exactly where it is most vulnerable. The woman is not afraid of us. That is the problem. Every person we have managed in this county has been afraid first and cooperative second. She arrived here afraid of nothing visible. He paused. That means she has something we haven't accounted for. He looked at Preston. Find out what it is, he said. Before Saturday morning, neither of them considered, not for a moment, that by the time Merritt finished speaking, the woman they were discussing was already asleep, 3 hours of it, earned, and that the records on the kitchen table of Ironback Creek Ranch were arranged in exactly the order she intended to use them, and that the witness list in her careful hand was complete, 11 names. Every one of them exactly where she needed them to be. Market day was in 4 days. She had used every one of the days before it. And Aldous Merritt, for all the power he held over 22 properties and 6 farming families and 1 exhausted sheriff, had not used his days half as well. They rode into Stone Falls at 8 in the morning. The market was already beginning. Wagons on every road leading in. Horses tied in rows along the north hitching posts. The baker's cart working. You could smell the bread from 2 blocks out. Children running the particular patterns. Children run when they've been in wagons for an hour, and their legs have formed opinions about it. Merchants laying goods on blankets. Cattle pens on the north end making their contributions to the general noise. Stone Falls alive. The one day of the month it was fully alive. And Colt felt it, the awareness, moving through the crowd as they rode in. The quiet, involuntary adjustment of people who have been watching something from a distance and are suddenly understanding that the distance is about to close. Because she was here, Sarah, the Apache woman, tied to the shame post on a Tuesday morning, while the whole town found other things to look at. Ridden out of town 4 days ago on the back of Colt Deering's horse with rope burns on her wrists and a judge's painted sign above her head, she was riding back in spine straight, chin level. The wooden crate of records balanced across her saddle. Dressed in the same pale yellow dress, washed and mended because she was not the kind of woman who let a dress tell the story of a bad week if she could help it, riding in like she owned the road, which, technically, nobody had told her she didn't. Solt appeared in his doorway, started to step back, caught himself, stepped forward instead, stayed there. Ezra Nance was at her gate on Mill Road. She gave Sarah a single nod, small, precise. Sarah nodded back, the specific communication of 2 women who understand each other without the use of words. Merritt was already on the courthouse steps. Of course he was positioned there deliberately. The elevated platform, the authority of the building behind him, the square in front of him, his square, his town, his arrangement. He saw them ride in. His expression did something very small and very controlled. Not fear, not yet, just recalculation. The specific micro-expression of a man who has been running one version of events in his head and has just received information that requires revision. Preston stood to his right. Preston saw Sarah and looked away immediately, which was its own kind of answer to questions nobody had asked out loud yet. Colt and Sarah dismounted at the edge of the square, tied the horses to the west hitching post, walked in. The crowd noise dropped as they moved through it. Not to silence, just dropped. The way a room drops when something important is entering it, before anyone is sure what the important thing is. Merritt waited until they were halfway across. Then he raised his voice, practiced authority. Years of it. The woman walking across this square is in violation of a lawful court sentence. Her presence here. I am here. Sarah said. Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It was clear, level, carrying across the square the way certain voices do, not by volume, but by the specific quality of having something real behind them. The crowd noise dropped further, real silence now. I am here, she said again, because the truth I was punished for telling needs to be said, the same place I was punished. In front of the same people, she reached into the satchel she carried, brought out the cufflink, silver, blue stone. Catching the morning light in a way that made it unmistakable from 20 feet away. This belongs to Preston Merritt, she said. He dropped it in the livery stable, the night of the payroll theft. The stable boy who found it will tell you so himself. Ike Callum stepped out of the crowd, on the left side, near the feed store, where Colt had told him to position himself 2 days ago. 15 years old, clean shirt. Shoulders set in the way shoulders set, when a person has to touch something and is not going to undecide it. Regardless of how their knees feel about the situation, his knees, from the look of it, had opinions. He ignored them. Merritt turned toward him. Boy, he was there, Ike said. His voice cracked on the first word, just the first one. Then it held. I was sleeping in the back stall because my room doesn't get air in summer. I heard Preston bring his horse in at 1 in the morning. Which wasn't right. He doesn't ride at night. He doesn't like it. He stopped, took a breath. He took something out of his saddlebag, wrapped it in a feed cloth, hid it behind the loose board in the third stall. And the next morning that board was moved and whatever he'd put there was gone. He held up the cufflink. Morning light hit the blue stone. He told me he'd send me to the reformatory in Wichita if I said anything. I was scared, he paused. I'm not anymore. The square was quiet. The specific quiet of 30 people holding their breath at the same time. Merritt turned toward the sheriff. Oakes, Dorsey Fane. Sarah said. Dorsey stepped out. Her voice was quieter than Ike's. But it did not move. I washed Preston Merritt's coat the morning after the payroll went missing. There was blood on the right cuff. Fresh. The kind that comes from a cut not from general wear. She looked directly at Preston. And the left sleeve was torn at the elbow, caught on something in the dark. A nail or a post corner. From the angle of the tear, she stopped. I have washed that man's clothes for 2 years. I know his garments. That was his coat. That blood was from the night of the theft. And I have been quiet about it since, because there was no one standing next to me when I tried to figure out what to say. Preston said nothing. Nothing at all, which was the loudest thing he'd done since the morning started. Ezra Nance, Sarah said. Ezra was already at the front of the crowd. Of course she was. She had moved there, sometime in the past 5 minutes. Quietly, without drawing attention. Just arrived at the place she needed to be, the way old women who have been paying attention their entire lives tend to arrive exactly where they're needed. Shawl on. Back straight. 73 years old, and not using a single one of them as an excuse. I live on the alley behind the courthouse, she said. The alley runs past my side window. The night in question was a Thursday. I know because Thursday is my mending night and I was up late. She looked at Preston. Direct. Unhurried. I heard a horse moving fast down that alley at 1 in the morning. I looked out. I know Preston Merritt's horse. Gray roan. White marking on the left foreleg. I have seen that animal enough times to identify it in darkness by the sound of its gait. She paused. He was carrying something. He was moving fast, and he did not want to be seen. Merritt's voice had changed register, still controlled, still the practiced authority, but thinner at the edges now. These are all individuals with Warren Holt, Sarah said. And this one landed differently, because Holt was not just a neighbor, not just a laundress or a store owner or a stable boy. Holt had been the county recorder for 11 years. He came out of the crowd and the space around him shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way space shifts when someone with institutional weight moves into it. He was carrying the wooden crate. He set it on the nearest market table. Opened it. I was county recorder for 11 years, he said. These are the original certified land records from my tenure. Every transfer, every deed registration, every mortgage filing I certified during that period. He looked at the crowd. I am asking anyone in this square to compare what is in this box with what is currently registered in the county office. He paused, because the Henderson property, the Aldred farm on the North Road, the Pewitt family near the creek, the Ree family land, and a 40-acre parcel on the eastern edge registered to a family named Running Bear, have all been transferred in the current county records to a holding company. Transfers that do not appear in the original, certified documents I am holding. He looked at Merritt. Transfers that were made after Judge Merritt replaced me with his own appointed recorder. The crowd had gone absolutely still, and then Clara Aldred's voice came from the middle of it. She was toward the back, Martin beside her, his hat in both hands, turning it the way a man turns something when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. We received a notice to vacate yesterday, Clara said. 30 days. After 6 years of payments on land that was transferred without our knowledge 2 years ago, her voice broke on the last 4 words, caught itself, steadied. My husband spent yesterday evening going through every record we have trying to find the payment he must have missed. Because that is what Martin does. He looks for his own mistake first. She looked at Merritt directly, the eyes of a woman who came in frightened and left that somewhere along the way. He did not make a mistake. He was robbed. And he is standing here now, not because he isn't ashamed, but because I told him that the shame in this situation does not belong to us. Something moved through the crowd, not a sound, a physical thing. The collective shift of people who have been carrying one version of a story, Merritt's version, the only one available, and are suddenly, publicly, offered a different one. And recognizing it as true, Gideon Solt. Sarah said Solt came forward from his doorway. He looked like a man walking toward something that might fall on him, but walking anyway, which is, if you think about it, the only kind of courage that actually counts. He opened his ledger. His hands were shaking. He didn't put it down to steady them, just held it. Shaking and open. The morning after the payroll went missing, he said. Preston Merritt came to my store. He paid for goods with gold coins, 3 of them, in denominations that matched the payroll amounts. He paused. I recorded the transaction. I have it here, and I have known since the day I wrote it down what those coins were and where they came from. He looked up at the crowd, at faces he had been selling goods to for years. People whose children's names he knew, whose debts he'd quietly extended when times were bad. I said nothing, he said, because I was afraid of what it would cost me, and I am sorry. I am genuinely, specifically sorry. For every day that I knew and said nothing, he held the ledger page up so the whole square could see it. Merritt stepped down from the courthouse steps, slowly, deliberately, the controlled movement of a man who still believes. Even now, even with the crate of original records on the market table, and 6 people standing in the open air, saying things that cannot be unsaid, that he can manage this, because he has managed rooms before. Because rooms like this one are familiar to him. Except this room had 11 people in it who had stopped being afraid at different moments over the past 4 days. And he hadn't been counting. Every person speaking in this square, he said, his voice carrying the weight of long practice, has a personal grievance against this court, debts, grudges, Individual disputes that, my mortgage, Colt said. He stepped forward. The crowd gave him room, not dramatically, just the natural adjustment of people making space for something that has decided to move. He had a paper in his hand, $28 in false fees added to my mortgage balance over 8 months, he said. Administrative processing charges I never agreed to. A drought assessment I was never informed of. A late payment penalty on a payment my own records show was received 4 days before it was due. He looked at the crowd. None of these fees appear in my original mortgage agreement. Every one of them was added without my knowledge, without my authorization, without any legitimate basis. He paused. And I am not the only one in that position. I would like to know how many people in this square have seen charges appear in their accounts that they didn't recognize and didn't remember agreeing to. He handed the paper to Hector Baines, a rancher standing at the edge of the crowd, 8 years in Stone Falls, whose face was already doing arithmetic. Hector looked at the paper, looked up, passed it to the woman beside him. She passed it on. The silence held for exactly 4 seconds. Then a woman near the back. We have one of those. A processing fee from last spring. Then a man by the feed store. I got a drought assessment in February. Nobody told me what it was for. Then another voice. And then they were all going at once. Overlapping, urgent, the specific sound that happens when a thing nobody has been saying out loud becomes the thing everybody is saying at the same time. Not shouting, talking. The low, urgent, unstoppable sound of 30 people. Comparing notes they didn't know they all had. The sound of a dam not breaking all at once. Breaking at every point simultaneously. Merritt turned to Preston. And Preston Merritt, 29 years old, wide shoulders, silver watch chain catching the light, looked at the cufflink in Ike's hand, at the records in Holt's crate, at the ledger in Salt's shaking grip, at the paper moving from hand to hand, at his uncle. And he said, not bravely, not with remorse, not with any quality that would have impressed anyone watching. He said it in the specific voice of a man whose calculation has just failed, and who is running a new one in real time. And this new one is about himself. He told me nobody would believe her. The square went quiet again. Different quiet this time. That's what he told me, Preston said. His voice conversational, almost wondering. Like he was reporting information about a stranger. She was nobody. The town would take his word over hers because that was how it worked. That was always how it worked, Preston. Merritt's voice at its lowest register. Preston kept going. The payroll is in the judge's office, he said, under the floor. Loose board, below the left window. He moved it from the stable when he found out she'd been in the building. He paused. He wrote the original complaint against her. Her name on it, my handwriting. But he wrote it. He told me what to say, and I said it. He looked at his uncle. You told me she was nobody, he said. You told me nobody was going to believe a cleaning woman over a judge. And I believed you. Because I always believed you. Because I didn't know how to think without using your conclusions. The square was so quiet you could hear the bread cart's horse shifting its weight. And then Colt stepped forward, not toward Merritt, not toward Preston, to the center of the square, where everyone could see him, where there was no question about who was speaking or why. He stood there for a moment, just stood, and then he said, I have to tell you about a man named Reuben Taft. Nobody knew that name. Most of them. Some of the older men, maybe. But most of the crowd heard it as the beginning of something and waited. 1881, Colt said. I was a federal investigator, working a horse theft case outside of Dodge City. A man named Reuben Taft had been accused. Black man. 32 years old. Family in Wichita. He was sending money to every month. He stopped. Let the square stay quiet. I found evidence that cleared him in the second week. Witness accounts that didn't line up. A brand inconsistency. Financial records that pointed to the ranch foreman. A man who had the access and the motive and the debt that Reuben Taft didn't have. He stopped again. I brought the evidence to my supervisor. He told me the case had already been built in a particular direction. That introducing what I'd found would complicate things for people above both of us. That my career would benefit from understanding that complication as something to avoid. A pause. I went home that night and I made myself the worst bargain a man can make. I told myself it wasn't my decision anymore. That the system would correct itself. That someone else would find the same evidence. He looked at the ground for exactly 1 second. Then back up. Reuben Taft was convicted. He died in the Lansing prison in March of 1882. Pneumonia. The winter was bad. The square did not move. I left the investigation service the following month, Colt said. I told my wife it was burnout, which was true, just not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had looked the other way when it mattered, when one person standing up would have made the difference, and I could not find a version of myself I could live with after that. So I came here and learned to fix fences instead. He paused. I am not standing in this square today because I am a better man than I was then. I am standing here because I am tired of being the man who knows and says nothing. And because there is a woman who has spent 4 days building something true, brick by brick, person by person, while a lot of us waited to see which direction the wind was going. He looked at the faces in the crowd. She did not wait, he said. She has never waited. She has been building. And I would rather stand on something she built, imperfect as I am, than watch from the side again, and remember it the way I remember. Reuben Taft. Nobody moved. For a long moment, nobody moved and nobody spoke. The market square of Stone Falls, Kansas held 30-odd people in the specific silence that comes after a true thing has been said in front of witnesses. Not a comfortable silence, not a forgiving one. The silence of people recognizing something in themselves that they hadn't been planning to recognize today. And then Sarah spoke, from where she stood in the center of the square. The crate of records at her feet, the morning sun fully over the courthouse now and showing everything in plain light. I was somebody, she said, clear voice, even carrying. Before any of you believed me, I was somebody when I was tied to that post. I was somebody when 30 people walked past and found other things to look at. I was somebody when the sign above my head said, otherwise. She looked at the faces in front of her, scared faces, ashamed ones. The face of Clara Aldred with tears she wasn't bothering to wipe. The face of Ike Callum, shoulders back, cufflink still in his closed fist. Looking like someone who has just put down a weight he didn't know he could put down. So is every person in this square that he taught you to fear, she said. So is every person he made you look past. That is what his system required. Your eyes on the ground. And every time you raised them, that was the beginning of the end of it. She looked at Oakes. Sheriff Devlin Oakes was standing at the edge of the courthouse steps. He had been there since they arrived, watching. Not moving, not positioning himself, just standing. The way a man stands when he is trying to figure out which direction to step in knows that whichever direction he chooses, he will have to live with it. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the crate of records. He looked at Ike Callum, holding the cufflink. He looked at Preston, staring at the ground with the expression of a man who has just finished explaining something that cannot be taken back. And Dad is Ely now beginning to understand the full weight of what that means. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Colt 11 years, a town, a gradual erosion, the specific math of what you lose when you let things go, one small compromise at a time. And don't look at the total until someone puts it in front of you in a public square. He looked at Sarah, and he took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep, and he walked past Merritt, past him. Not stopping, not explaining. He put his hand on Preston's arm. Come on, he said. Merritt's voice came sharp. You work for me. Oakes stopped, turned, looked at the judge with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for 2 years and has just set it down. I work for this county, he said. Quiet, not performing it, just saying it. I always should have. He walked Preston toward the jail. Not fast, Not dramatic, just walked. Merritt stood on the courthouse steps, alone now, the crowd around him, not moving toward him, not angry, not violent, just closing. The quiet, inexorable pressure of people who have stopped looking away. And for the first time in 4 years, there was nothing behind his position. No fear to rest it on, no isolation to exploit, no calculation that still worked because too many people were looking at the same numbers at the same time, and the numbers were refusing to behave. He said nothing. Because there was nothing left that would do what he needed it to do. He looked smaller. That was the strangest part. What Colt would remember most clearly later. Standing in that square, watching Merritt on his steps, and seeing for the first time what the man actually was. Not a monster, not a force, an ordinary man in a good coat who had used a position and a system and other people's fear to become something larger than his actual dimensions. And now that the system was visible, now that everyone in the square was looking at it at the same time, the actual dimensions were all that remained. Just a man, standing on steps, while the town he had managed for 4 years turned its back on him. And then, Aldous Merritt did the thing that nobody expected. He looked at Sarah directly, not with anger, not with the authority of someone about to make a point, with something that had been locked away for a long time and had just run out of room. "I was a good man," he said. "Once, when I came to this territory, the square was very quiet. The county was failing," he said. "Farms going under, families leaving. The land records were a mess. I came here with legal training and the genuine intention of building something that worked." He stopped. "The first time I adjusted a number in a ledger, it was to prevent a family from losing their farm in a year when the harvest had failed through no fault of their own. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would correct it. When the season improved," he paused, "it didn't need correcting, because nobody noticed. And I discovered something I did not expect to discover about myself. That the absence of consequences changes a man's relationship with the decision he's made. Not all at once, slowly. In amounts too small to feel on any given day." He looked at the crowd, not asking for anything from them, not performing. Just reporting, the way a man reports something he has examined and found to be true. "The second time I adjusted a number, it was easier. The third time I did not require a reason. By the 10th time I had stopped thinking of it as an adjustment at all. It had simply become the way things were done." He stopped. "I cannot tell you the exact day I became the person standing on these steps. I looked for that day for a long time. I believe it does not exist as a single day. I believe it was 1,000 days. Each one small enough to step over. Each one stepping you further from the place you started." He looked at Sarah one more time. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I am saying this so that you understand what I understand, which is that the thing I became does not arrive with a warning. It arrives in the accumulation of small choices that each felt at the time like something other than what they were." He stopped. "That is the only true thing I have left to say. And I did not want to waste it." The square was so still, you could hear the bread cart's horse blowing air through its nose 40 feet away. And then the voices started, not from one place. From everywhere, low and urgent and building, but different now from the voices before, not just comparing notes, not just recognizing shared injury, something warmer. Something that happens when people who have been alone in something discover, all at once, that they are not alone. Martin Aldred was there, toward the back of the crowd where Colt would have expected him to be, because Martin Aldred was a man who showed up to difficult things and stood at the edge, until he'd worked out what his presence meant, standing next to Clara. His hat still in both hands. Clara said something to him, too quiet to hear. Martin's face did something complicated. The specific complexity of a man, processing the distance between what he had believed was his failure and what had actually been done to him. The difference between those two things is not small. The shift from one to the other is not fast, but it was happening. Colt watched Martin Aldred put his arm around his wife. watched Clara lean into it, looked away to give them that Sarah was, of course she was. The moment Oakes had walked Preston toward the jail, before the voices had even fully started, she had turned to Solt, written statement, signed, before end of day. Everything you told me and everything you showed me in the ledger. Solt had nodded, with the energy of a man whose guilt has just been given somewhere productive to go. She did the same with Dorsey, same with Ezra. Colt watched her move through the crowd, not rushing, not performing urgency, just working. The way she had always worked. Since the first morning at Ironback Creek, when he'd found her in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, with his ledgers open, and a charcoal pencil in her hand, and the particular focused expression of someone who has identified a problem and is already 3 steps into solving it. He had thought, that morning, that she was remarkable. He had been right. He just hadn't known yet how much ground that word would need to cover. Holt appeared at her side. I need to ride to the federal land office in Abilene, he said, today. Before, his man in the recorder's office has time to. Today, she said. Don't wait for morning. Holt looked at her, at the crate in his arms. At the town around him, the town he had left 2 years ago because he couldn't stomach staying, whose people he had watched being slowly robbed from a distance, the evidence under his arm that represented 11 years of careful work, and the reason he had kept all of it. Yes, he said. Today, he shook Colt's hand, nodded to Sarah, and moved through the crowd toward the livery, with the purposeful stride of a man who has finally been given permission to do the thing he's been waiting to do for 2 years. Ike was still holding the cufflink, standing where he'd been standing when he stepped out, looking at the jail building with an expression that was younger than 15 and older than 15 simultaneously. Sarah walked over to him. Give it to Oakes, she said. When you're ready. He needs it for the formal filing. Ike looked at the cufflink in his palm, closed his fingers around it. Is it done? He said. She looked at him carefully. She wanted to give him the clean answer, the simple one, the one that made everything feel finished. She didn't. The hardest part is done, she said. What comes next is paperwork and time. But Preston is in that jail and your evidence put him there. That is real. That cannot be undone. He nodded slowly. Opened his hand one more time. Looked at the cufflink. Mrs. Nance said I could stay with her until things settle, he said. That's a good place to be. A pause. She makes terrible biscuits, he said. And Sarah, who had not smiled once in 5 days, not properly, not the kind that reaches all the way. Almost did. Tell her I said so, she said, and see how that works out for you. Ike actually laughed. Short. Surprised. The laugh of a boy who has forgotten for several weeks that laughing is something he does. He walked toward the jail with his shoulders in a different position than they'd been in since the whole thing started. Sarah watched him go, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't victory. More durable than victory. The specific satisfaction of a thing done right, not because it was easy, not because it cost nothing, but because the people who deserved to be standing at the end of it were standing. Merritt hasn't been arrested yet, Colt said quietly, appearing at her shoulder. She looked toward the courthouse steps. Merritt was still there, not having moved, but the thing that had made him dangerous was gone. What was left was an ordinary man in a good coat standing in a place that used to mean something and now just meant steps. He'll have a lawyer by tomorrow, she said. He'll argue jurisdiction, question the evidence chain. Let him. The federal land office doesn't answer to him, she said. And once Holt files those originals, every transfer his recorder made in 2 years is subject to review. She looked at the steps. He built his system on the assumption that no single person had enough pieces to challenge it. He was right about that. One person doesn't. She paused. It took 11, 12, Colt said. She looked at him. You keep leaving yourself out of the count, he said. You were the first one standing. That counts. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Not because the gaze was uncomfortable. because the feeling that came with it was not something a crowded market square was the right place for. "Let's go home," she said. And then she heard what she'd said. Colt heard it too. He didn't comment, just nodded and turned toward the horses, and she walked beside him, and Martin Aldred reached out as they passed and said, "Thank you," in a voice with nothing extra in it at all. "Take care of your land, Mr. Aldred," she said. "It's mine again," she nodded once. Kept walking, the word was still there, in her chest, small and new and requiring more examination than she had time for right now home. She'd figure out what it meant later. As it turned out, later was 3 weeks away and arrived in the form of a letter from the Federal Land Office in Abilene. They rode home in the quiet that comes after something enormous. The kind where both people are carrying the same thing and neither needs to say so. The formal unraveling took longer than the public moment. That was the thing nobody told you about justice. The thing that happened in the square was only the first sentence. The rest of the document was slower, more administrative, required the kind of sustained attention that doesn't feel like anything. No pulse jump, no crowd, no moment you can point to and say there. Just the patient work of documentation and filing and the careful, sequential presentation of evidence to people with the authority to act on it. Sarah knew this. She had known it before market day. She had factored it into every calculation she'd made in Colt's kitchen over the past week. The formal complaint was filed with the county sheriff's office, Oaks, who signed it with the specific penmanship of a man, writing something he is determined to get exactly right. Holt reached Abilene in 2 days. Hard riding. He filed the original records with the Federal Land Office before close of business on the second day. The Federal Land Office opened a formal review within a week. Merritt was arrested 11 days after market day. Not by Oaks, by federal marshals who arrived from Abilene with paperwork that his lawyer read 3 times and could not find a credible argument against. He was charged with land fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud landholders through the deliberate alteration of county records. His lawyer tried. The records didn't care what the lawyer tried. Preston cooperated with the investigation in exchange for consideration. His cooperation confirmed everything: the payroll theft, the deed alterations, the false mortgage fees across 9 families, and one thing that had not yet been public. The death of Thomas Whitfield in 1883 had not been fever. It had been arranged. To clear the title on his property, Merritt was additionally charged with accessory to murder. The man who had told himself in the beginning that he was saving a failing county had, over 4 years, stolen land from 9 families, collected fraudulent mortgage payments, and arranged the death of a man who had been inconveniently in the way. He had not started as a monster. He had become one in amounts too small to feel. That was what the town of Stone Falls took from it in the end. Not the arrests, not the returned land, not even the corrected ledgers. The specific and unsettling understanding that it doesn't arrive with a warning. A letter came to Ironback Creek 3 weeks after market day. Federal Land Office letterhead. 2 pages. Formal language acknowledging receipt of Warren Holt's certified records and the opening of a formal review into all county record alterations made after April 1884, including the unauthorized transfer of a 40-acre parcel registered to a family named Running Bear Sarah's cousin's land. Calming back. She read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table, sat with her hands in her lap and just breathed. Colt came in from the south pasture and saw her face. "Good news or bad?" he said. She pushed the letter across the table to him. He read it. He looked up. "You did that," he said. "We did that." "No," he set the letter down. "I cut a rope. You built everything that came after it. I want you to be clear about that. Not for my sake, for yours. Because I know what it's like to look back at something and lose track of who did what. And I don't want you to lose that." She looked at him for a long moment. "The Henderson land is restored," she said. "The Aldreds, the Poot family, the Reese. My cousin's 40 acres. She said each name carefully, like placing something where it belongs. Ike isn't in the reformatory. Ezra keeps her cottage. Dorsey's permit stands. Solt. She paused. Solt is apparently going through his ledgers and correcting every credit extension he let slide over the past 2 years. On his own initiative. Without being asked. People surprise you, Colt said. Sometimes, she said. When someone stops first. She pulled a paper across the table, toward him, figures in her small, precise hand. Your mortgage, she said. The corrected balance. The actual balance. Without the false fees, is 14 months from paid. If you sell the East grazing lease through the end of summer and reinvest in cattle numbers by fall, you can make the final payment 12 months ahead of schedule. He looked at the paper, then at her. Of course you did the math, he said. I'm a bookkeeper, she said. He looked at the figures for a real moment, actually reading them. Following the logic of what she'd laid out, when he looked up, his face had the expression she'd learned to recognize. The one that appeared when he was moved by something, and was deciding what portion of that to show. Stay, he said. She looked at him. Not for the mortgage calculations, he said. Although I will not pretend those aren't useful. Stay because this table is better with you at it. Fuck, stay because this ranch has been a place where I kept things alive, without actually living in it, and I am tired, genuinely, specifically tired, of knowing the difference between those two things and choosing the wrong one. He paused. Stay because I'm asking. And because I think you want to. And because we are both old enough and honest enough to stop performing the part where we pretend otherwise. She looked at the table. At the letter from the Federal Land Office. At the mortgage calculations in her own handwriting. At the tin cup he'd set in front of her when he came in. Without ask, she wanted it, without ceremony, just placed there. The way you place something for a person whose habits you've been paying attention to. I told you to ask me in a month, she said. I'm asking in a month, he said. It has been a very concentrated month. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the Tuesday morning they'd tied her to that post. Since the rope and the heat and the painted sign, and 30 people finding other things to look at. She let the thing she'd been keeping carefully managed come all the way to the surface. It was not relief, it was not victory, it was not happiness exactly. It was the specific feeling of a person who has been fighting for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere safe, and is only now, in this kitchen, with this man and this table and this tin cup, remembering what safety feels like, what it means to be somewhere you don't have to manage everything. Yes, she said. He was still then. Yes, you'll stay, or yes to the other thing? Both, she said. Obviously, they married in October, under the cottonwood trees at the north edge of Ironback Creek Ranch, where the leaves were coming down in the particular copper and gold of a Kansas autumn. The colors that seem almost deliberately extravagant after a summer that had spent 3 months trying to kill everything green. The people who came were the people who had stood in the square. Ezra, in her good dress, the one she'd been finishing the collar on the night she first heard the truth about Preston Merritt's horse. Ike, taller somehow than he'd been in July, standing the way a boy stands when someone has handed him back his own dignity. Dorsey, the Aldreds, the Puett family, Warren Holt, who had ridden down from Abilene and shook Colt's hand for a long time, without saying anything, which was its own kind of speech. Devlin Oaks stood at the back, did not move closer, which was appropriate. He had done the right thing too late, and he knew it, and he was there anyway. That was enough. The ceremony was short, because neither of them had any interest in performance. They had done the real work already, across a kitchen table, and a fence line, and a market square, and 5 sleepless days, and 100 small moments of deciding to trust each other when there was no guarantee it would hold. Reverend Harmon said the words. The same man who had walked past the shame post, looking at the ground, which had been, Sarah had decided, the most honest response in the square that Tuesday morning. He had known he was doing wrong. He had not hidden that from himself, and 3 weeks after market day, he had come to Ironback Creek and asked if there was anything he could do that would be useful. She had said, "Yes, there is one thing." Colt said his words without looking away from her face. Sarah said hers and felt them land the way true things land. Not with a burst of feeling, not dramatically, with the quiet, permanent click of something moving into the correct position after a long time in the wrong one. Afterward, when the gathering had settled into the yard with food and the warmth of people who have been through something difficult together and are still here, Ezra found Sarah near the cottonwood trees. "I owe you an apology," Ezra said. "For what?" "For not going to that post anyway." She looked at the trees, at the light coming through the turning leaves. "When Merritt's man turned me back, I should have gone anyway. I should have sat down on the ground next to you and let them do whatever they were going to do. Because nothing he could have done to me was worse than what I did to myself by walking away." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You tried," she said, when most people had already decided not to. "It wasn't enough." "No," Sarah said, "it wasn't. But it was the beginning of enough. And sometimes that is what one person can give." She held the older woman's gaze. "You came forward when it mattered. You stood in that square. That matters too. Not instead of the other thing." In addition to it, Ezra pressed her hand briefly, moved back toward the gathering, and Sarah stood for a moment under the cottonwood trees, leaves coming down around her in copper and gold. The sound of the people she had spent 5 days building something, with filling the afternoon of a ranch that had stopped being empty. Colt found her there. He stood beside her, and they both looked south toward the pasture, the repaired fence, the cattle moving in the distance with the slow, purposeful confidence of animals who have no idea how close they came to losing the ground beneath them. "They put up the bench last week," Colt said. "Outside the new schoolhouse." She looked at him. "From the post?" "Most of it. Martin Aldred's idea. He said he wanted something that lasted longer than shame." She was quiet. "The shame post. 8 feet of painted wood pulled out of the ground on a Saturday morning by 11 men who hadn't needed to say anything significant about why they were there. Turned into a bench outside a schoolhouse door. A place to sit. A place where tired people and small people and people carrying things could rest without anyone asking what they were carrying or why they looked the way they looked. And on that bench, for the first time in the history of Stone Falls, Apache children and Anglo children might sit down next to each other between lessons and argue about something that had nothing to do with whose land was whose. "The nail holes are still there," Colt said. "They didn't fill them in. Martin said it was the town's decision, not his. So he left it to whoever sat down." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "That's right." He looked at her. "You all right?" "I'm thinking about a word," she said. "Which word?" "Home," she said. "I'm thinking about how long it's been since I said it and meant it completely." He put his hand against the back of her head, gently, "The way you touch something you have committed to taking care of." She leaned back into it by approximately half an inch, which was enough. "You can mean it now," he said. She looked at the south pasture, at the repaired fence, at the ranch that had been kept alive without being lived in, that was figuring out now, slowly, what the difference felt like. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm thinking about." The autumn light came through the cottonwood branches, copper and gold, landing on the dry grass of a ranch that had learned, this particular summer, what it meant to be held. And somewhere in Stone Falls, a bench made from an old post of shame sat outside a schoolhouse door, waiting for whoever needed it. Nobody had painted over the grain of the wood. Nobody had filled the nail holes. Because some things should be remembered, not to keep the wound open, but to know the exact distance traveled from what was to what is, so that when someone asks, "How far can one person's decency carry?" you have a true answer, and the answer is, further than fear every time. Sarah had stood at a post, in the July heat with her name called a lie, and 30 people's silence for company. She had not broken. She had not begged. She had waited for one decent person, and one decent person, imperfect, carrying his own reckoning, 40 years old and tired of being the man who knew and said nothing, had come, and together they had built the truth into something that no single man's fear could take apart. Because that is what fear relies on. It relies on you believing you are alone in what you see, that no one else sees it, that the person calling you a liar has more authority over reality than you do. But 30 people's silence is not agreement. It is 30 people who have not yet found each other, and one act of conscience, one knife, one cut rope. One woman refusing to look away from the faces, looking away from her. That was the first word of a story that a whole town eventually learned to tell about itself. And a story told in the open belongs to everyone. That is the thing about shame. It cannot survive daylight, not real daylight. Not the kind where people are standing in it, together, refusing to be small.